Maharajah's General by Paul Fraser Collard. Read by Dudley Hinton. Chapter 1. The British officer gripped the window frame tightly as the dak gharry lurched and scrabbled its way closer to the city of Bundapur. He held fast until the wild pitching ceased, the action instinctive after so long incarcerated in a seemingly never-ending procession of carriages, palkis and dollies. His exhausting journey had taken weeks, and now, as he finally neared his destination, the officer felt the stirring of unease deep in his gut. He tugged nervously on the hem of his scarlet shell jacket with the green facings of his new regiment, before running his hand over his unfashionably short hair. He had dressed at the caravanserai where he had spent the night. Unlike so many of the British officers, he eschewed any form of facial hair, and that morning he had shaved closely, meticulously in his preparation, the ritual of preparing for the day ahead deeply ingrained. Now he was anxious that he looked travel-worn and unkempt, so he brushed at his uniform, doing his best to straighten out the inevitable creases and remove the most obvious specks of dirt. He was reaching the end of the last leg of a journey that had started far away on the Crimean peninsula. Months of travel had led to this moment, to the last hours before he caught up with his fate. He patted the pocket of his scarlet coat, checking for the umpteenth time that his documents were still in place. They had brought him this far. The next few hours would tell him if they would see him safely ensconced in his new home and in his place as a commissioned officer in one of Her Majesty's regiments. The precious papers, now creased and worn, named the officer as Captain James Danbury of Her Majesty's 24th Regiment of Foot. A captain was a man of station and importance, one who would be expected to take his place in the British establishment that ruled a land so far from home. The 24th's newest officer sat back amidst the cushions and pillows of the dak and thought on what he knew of his new command. The 24th was a regular army regiment. It was stationed in India to bolster the forces of the East India Company, the mercantile company that administered and ruled the country in the name of the Queen. The East India Company ostensibly borrowed and paid for the regular troops who were spread amongst the three presidencies into which the country was divided. Each presidency boasted its own army. The bulk of each force was made up of native infantry regiments, composed of locally recruited soldiers, led by British officers. Alongside these native regiments were a number of European infantry battalions whose ranks were filled by British and Irish recruits. The officers of both held commissions granted by the East India Company rather than by the Queen. It led to a social distinction between the Queen's officers in the regular army regiments and those only holding a commission granted by the EIC. The officer had only been in the country for a few short weeks, but already he had learnt that snobbery was rife, the intricate layers of society guarded with a diligence and a jealousy that would shock even the snootiest London matriarch. The man possessing the papers of Captain Danbury would take his place in the 24th's hierarchy, assuming command of a company of redcoats. It was a precious responsibility, but not one with which he was unfamiliar. He had commanded a company in the Crimea at the tumultuous battle at the Alma River. There he had learnt what it truly meant to lead men, the responsibility that came with the shiny gold buttons and being called Sir. Being an officer was a position that few deserved and even fewer earned. Yet the man in the dak gharry had travelled thousands of miles for the opportunity to once again command the men so cruelly titled the scum of the earth, risking his life for the sake of a tattered parchment and the power it ordained. for Captain James Danbury was dead. His name, identity and uniform now belonged to Jack Lark, an impostor who sat in the lurching Dak Gharry, his guts screwed tight with tension as he anxiously waited to discover if his newest identity would pass muster, or if he was simply being transported to denunciation and a cold, lonely dawn on the scaffold. Jack cursed as the Dak lurched, forcing him to grab at the seat opposite to avoid being thrown into an undignified heap on the floor. As he recovered his poise, he saw a small, dark-faced child capering in the scrubby field beside the road, clearly entranced by an imaginary game. Jack smiled as he watched the boy at play, envying him his freedom. He looked past the boy, his attention taken by a forbidding tower on the skyline. It dominated the small village that clustered around its skirts, casting a long shadow across the sorry collection of drab mud and thatch houses. The tower was battered, a relic of a distant past, yet there was a dignity to it, a grace that belied the pockmarked walls and broken stone. It had endured through the centuries, its lonely vigil immune to the machinations of men. It was a symbol of what had been, and Jack shivered as an uneasy chill ran down his spine. He hid his own past away, refusing to dwell on the dark memories that lurked in the corner of his mind, and forced himself to think of what was to come. He had journeyed far, chasing a future that was not his own. He was fast approaching the time when he would confront it and discover his fate. Sujan saw the tiger, yet he felt no fear. The huge beast crept through the thick grass and would have passed by unnoticed were it not for the warrior who guarded his family's goats so diligently. Only the bravest could take up their spear and move silently towards the mighty hunter, whose power terrified lesser men, men who would run screaming in fear at the merest glimpse of his shadow. Sujan hefted his weapon, feeling the balance in its beautifully crafted shaft. The weight was reassuring in his hand, and his fingers curled around the lovingly polished wood, his fingertips caressing the intricate carvings that had taken the best craftsmen in the village days of toil to create. Slowly, patiently, he eased his way to where the huge animal had stopped, its mouth open as it tasted the air. He took no chances as he manoeuvred stealthily to free up a clean shot for his spear, taking his time, his eyes never leaving his target. Then the tiger saw him and roared. A weaker man would have fled, his precious goats left for the beast to devour. Yet Sujan rose fearlessly from his haunches, his muscles stretched tight as he pulled back his arm. With every ounce of his strength he flung his spear at the huge animal, an involuntary grunt forced from his lips. Driven by a skill only the mightiest of warriors possessed, the spear exploded through the grasses, the razor-sharp tip at its point tearing through the tiger's powerful body, embedding itself in the animal's heart, killing the fearful beast in an instant. Seeing his foe struck down, Sujan leapt to his feet, his arms flung wide in celebration, his face creased in a triumphant scowl, his voice screeching in delight. The high-pitched wail scared an ancient vulture into reluctant flight from where it had watched the contest from a nearby rock, the sudden movement silencing the hero's wild roars of victory. Sujan walked forward, bending low to retrieve the thin, splintered stick, the only weapon his grandfather trusted him with to guard the 10 flea-bitten goats in the family herd. With his hand scratching busily under his langotti, Sujan turned his back on the boulder he had slain. The fearsome tiger was nothing more dangerous than a moss-covered rock that had taken the small boy's fancy as he idled away the long afternoon waiting for his grandfather to appear to help him drive the meagre herd back to their home on the far side of the village. At 7, Sujan was left alone for most of the day with just the sinewy goats for company and his eager imagination for entertainment. The small boy pulled aside his loincloth, carelessly emptying his bladder into a thorny bush as he tried to conjure up another game to while away the lonely tedium of another hour. He looked around sharply as he heard the sound of a dak, his thin stream of urine meandering across the dusty soil as he turned. His face twisted with hatred as he saw the dak gharry bouncing its way along the trunk road to Bundapur. He caught a glimpse of a white face staring in his direction, another Farangi officer on his way to join the foreigners' camp outside the city. The officer lifted a hand in greeting, his cold grey stare disconcerting even from a distance. Sujan turned away, spitting into the dust, just as his grandfather did whenever he talked of the pale Farangi who had come from the cold lands to rule over them. Sujan did not understand why men like his grandfather had allowed the foreigners to take control of their country, but he had learned not to ask. He was cuffed around the head too often enough already. At least the white men and their fat women were good for the village. They came in small parties to stare at the tower, the loud, red-faced men and the shrieking, brazen women gazing in wonder at the place where the villagers had taken the bodies of their dead relatives since time immemorial. The Farangi were easy prey for the sharp-minded locals, who charged an extortionate fee for their meagre offering of hospitality and grew fat on the money. No other village in the valley could hope to match their wealth. Sujan finished pissing and went back to his goats, yelling at one that was drifting too far on its tireless quest to find food. He looked at the sky and saw that it would be hours yet until his grandfather returned, so he closed his eyes and tried to conjure the image of a wandering vagabond, an interesting challenge for the warrior who was charged with defending his family's precious herd. He opened his eyes as he heard the sound of movement. He expected to see another dak on its long journey to the British cantonment at Bundapur, but his eyes widened in horror, as instead he saw his imagination given life, though he had never conceived of a horde such as the one that had appeared over the crest of the ridge to the south of the village. Forgetting his goats and the duty his grandfather had beaten into him since he had first learned to walk, the boy ran. For the wild men had come down from the hills. The bandits, the dacoits and the thugs, the landless men, the bitter and the disappointed, the unloved and the unwanted. They came in a mob, a wave of hatred that washed across the dusty ground, smothering the sun-bleached soil with fear. The villagers watched in horror as the end of their precious existence arrived, their wealth and pride the bait that had lured the monster from out of the darkness. The silent tower now set to bear witness to the bandits' desire for vengeance on those who had condemned them to the bitter life of the banished. They were led by the one they called the Tiger. Some said he was not a man at all, but a god, or a prince of the darkness that shrouded the godless. No mortal man could stand against him. Those who tried were killed, struck down by his merciless hand or by his word, a curse from the lips of the Tiger certain to bring only lingering agony, followed by death. Yet men flocked to his banner, intent on theft, on rape, and on revenge on the world that had forgotten them. The Tiger offered them all a home, a sanctuary, uniting them in hatred against the Maharajah of Sawad, who had condemned them to their loveless fate and who ruled their land with an iron rod. Men found guilty of any crime were sentenced to mutilation, death, or banishment, the living death that was so much more painful than a swift beheading or precise strangulation. Now the Maharajah had learnt of their band. He had pledged their annihilation, his honour stained by their very being. So the bandits lived a life of fear, always moving on, never staying in one place for too long as they tried to outrun the retribution that was sure to find them. The village and its precious tower would offer them rich pickings, providing food and shelter for a week, perhaps 2. They would strip it bare, using its people and feeding on its abundant supplies before they moved on to the next place. They did not fear the tower or its white-robed priests. The tiger and his men had long left behind the superstitious world of religion and its many and various gods. Their souls were already lost, and they swept through the village like a plague. Chapter 2. Captain Danbury, what a delightful surprise. Jack Lark did his best to look composed as he was led into the office of his new commanding officer. He nodded his thanks to the khansamah who had ushered him into the spacious room. The shuffling figure bowed obsequiously, his hand fluttering across his face, his discomfort at being thanked obvious. "No need to thank the damn steward. You quite made his day by not cuffing him around the ears." The officer seated behind the monstrous mahogany desk rose to his feet, his wide-backed chair scraping noisily across the highly polished wooden floor. "Proudfoot." He thrust his hand forward forcefully. "Danbury." Jack did his best to hide his amusement at the curt introduction, giving his assumed name with as much confidence as he could summon. He took the hand offered to him, shaking it firmly whilst wondering at the strange figure welcoming him to his new post. Proudfoot was close to a foot shorter than Jack. Behind the bushy beard and thick moustache, his face bore the evidence of a long time spent in the East, a craggy network of creases, folds, and wrinkles that made him appear older than his 41 years. Yet it was not his premature age alone that made him fascinating. Jack studied with growing amusement the strange attire his new commander wore, the contrast to his own regimental uniform stark. Proudfoot chose to dress as a nabob, with a flowing, richly decorated tunic over baggy pantaloons. A fine web of coloured thread spread over the cream linen, creating intricate patterns that rippled and moved as he returned to his seat behind the slab of mahogany that was more comparable to a dining table than the humble working desk of an official in the East India Company. A slight grimace of distaste on his face made it clear he had noticed the wry scrutiny of his choice of clothes. "Take a seat." Proudfoot indicated a fine leather chair opposite his own. He followed the invitation by bellowing at the pankawala, a young boy of no more than 10 who sat in the corner of the room, pulling on a thick cord that moved the large sail attached to the ceiling back and forth, wafting a gentle breeze down onto the official and his guest. Chastened by his master's rebuke, the boy bent his head so that his forehead was an inch away from the floor, whilst his wiry arms increased the tempo of the fan's motion. "Now, to business." Proudfoot gathered up the documents he had been working on and shuffled them into an ordered pile, before placing them neatly to one side. He took a moment to line them up so they were perfectly perpendicular to a small stack of similar thick cream papers waiting for his attention. "So, Danbury, why aren't you dead?" The question was delivered deadpan, without a trace of humour or warmth. Jack's face remained collected while he thought about the odd question, even though his heart was racing 10 to the dozen as he felt the strings of his new life unravelling before it had even begun. Would you care to explain that remark, sir?" "What I mean, my dear fellow," Proudfoot smiled, but with little evidence of good humour, "is that I received a letter just a few days ago regretfully informing me that the recent purchaser of the vacant commission in the 24th had died in the Crimea, and that I was to expect notice of a new purchaser within the month. You are meant to be dead, Danbury. Quite dead." "I'm sorry to disappoint you, sir, but as you can see, I'm very much alive." "Indeed, so I see. The paperwork will be quite incorrect now, damn it." Proudfoot cursed, his irritation obvious. "Well, I suppose it cannot be helped. I shall be forced to write a letter to the governor's office to let them know of the change of circumstances. It really would have been simpler if you were dead." Jack smiled. "Not for me." Proudfoot stared hard, his eyes searching Jack's face for a sign of insubordination. He scowled, clearly displeased with whatever he saw there, then turned his attention to his steel pen, fastidiously wiping clean the nib, meticulously removing every vestige of ink. When he was quite satisfied, he placed the pen on the top of the closest pile of documents, his hand immediately returning to it to fussily ensure that it was lined up at right angles to the top of the papers. "Welcome." Proudfoot delivered the belated greeting with gusto, as if he had resolved to start the conversation afresh and put Jack's inconvenient health to one side. "Welcome to Bundapur." "Thank you. I'm pleased to be here at last. It's been a long journey." Jack hid his relief. He felt his unease begin to fade. It was unsettling to hear that Proudfoot had not been expecting Danbury's arrival, but he had a feeling the wheels of government would run slowly on the frontier of the Empire. He could only hope that Proudfoot's letter would create enough confusion to make sure he was safe, for the time being at least. Once settled at Bundapur, he could do his best to make sure that confusion continued, and hope that no one would look to find a replacement for an officer who had already arrived. "Indeed. We are glad to have you with us." Proudfoot eased back in his chair, more comfortable now the conversation had turned towards less irregular matters. "We're a small band, but we all rub along quite nicely. As I'm sure you're aware, I'm the only political officer here. I report directly to the governor, but other than that I'm pretty much left to my own devices." He shrugged his shoulders in a theatrical gesture of modesty, before shaking his head as if unable to comprehend quite how he had managed to cope with such a challenging remit. "When you think that this area is the size of half a dozen English counties put together, you'll begin to understand the task at hand. As you will know, I run the affairs of the company in Sawad. I am the commander of all the forces here, both military and police. I am both magistrate and superintendent of law, and I'm even in charge of the jail itself. I run the treasury, and am responsible for all our accounts, whilst also being both the assessor and collector of taxes. For all public works, I am executive engineer as well as superintendent. I am postmaster, commissioner of the ordnance, and I even supervise the mule train and the company bullocks. In short, Danbury, I am king, general, judge, and jury." Jack did his best to seem impressed. "It sounds interesting." Proudfoot's face creased into a frown at the mild response. He shook his head again before resolving to carry on. "Let me show you the lie of the land." He disappeared momentarily from view as he rummaged in the bottom right-hand drawer of his enormous desk. When he re-emerged, he unrolled a creased and well-used map covered with a network of penciled comments in a web of different coloured lines and circles. "Here we are." He thrust his ink-stained thumb into the dead centre of the unrolled map. "Just north of the region we know now as the Bundelkhand Agency, an area ruled by a menagerie of misfits and despots until we finally forced them to cede power to us back in '02. We now run the place, but we allow most of the damn Maharajahs to keep their titles so long as they give us free rein and sign their Ikranama." Proudfoot paused as he looked up to check that Jack was paying full attention. He was pleased to see him staring hard at the map, his face creased in concentration. "We are here, in Bundapur," Proudfoot continued, "slap bang in the centre of Sawat. To the north is Oud, the only other state that is still nominally independent. Over here to the west is Yansi, the biggest of the local states, with a bitch of a Rani called Lakshmibai on the throne. We have at least been able to annex the damn place, and it now falls under the control of the Central India Agency, which also runs the states in Bundelkhand. The old Rajah died without an heir, so we were able to apply Lord Dalhousie's doctrine, taking the place properly under British rule. It's so much simpler that way, although allowing the Rani stay on is a mistake, in my opinion. The little strumpet is bound to cause trouble sooner or later. I've written to the governor, but for the moment that is how things stand. Otherwise, I find myself very much in agreement with Dalhousie's policy. The management of the country will be safer and more efficient if we can reduce the number of these damned feudal states by annexing as many as we can. Do you agree, Danbury?" Jack was beginning to feel out of his depth. He had learnt a little of the politics of the country during his journey, but there were still wide gaps in his knowledge. He would have to learn fast. "I believe we must do what we can to improve the lot of the poorer classes, sir. I would say that it is our duty, and if annexation allows us to achieve it, then I believe that is the path we must follow. I understand these Maharajahs are a whimsical bunch. Under their rule, the people have no protection, and that cannot be a happy state of affairs." "Whimsical?" Proudfoot found Jack's choice of word amusing. "I have never known a more decadent, lazy, conceited, and callow collection of creatures than these Maharajahs. We must take them all firmly under our control. We have already been successful by annexing Yansi, Satara, and Nagpur, and I see no reason why we should not do the same here." He sat back in his chair. "Have you heard much of the Maharajah of Sawad?" "Only a little. I understand that he rules here under your supervision as resident." "Well, you're correct on that point." Proudfoot smiled in recognition of his own status before his face quickly creased into another scowl. "Sawad became one of our princely states after the fall of the last Marathas. The previous Maharaja saw sense and signed his treaty with barely a quibble when he saw what happened to anyone foolish enough to stand against us. The agreement allows his family continue to rule here, but under my supervision. I won't bore you with the details, but in short, it allows us to make a great deal of money through loans from the Maharaja to our treasury, and by charging for the presence of our forces here." Jack did not have to feign his interest. The complicated network of treaties, agencies, annexation, and agents was still foreign to him, and he was keen to learn more. "So, it sounds like we have what we want here." "Not at all." Proudfoot revealed what he thought of Jack's naive observation with a theatrical wave of his hand. "We do well enough financially, but we lack full control. Added to that, the Maharajah is a damn pest. Not that I'm granted more than a moment in the great man's presence. Never more than once a month, anyway, and that's only if he leaves his citadel out in the middle of nowhere and actually deigns to come to Bundapur. When we do meet, he nods and smiles and says all the right things, yet he's constantly pushing against my authority, making appointments without my approval, building up the defences at that palace of his, or sending his army here, there, and yonder without my permission. The damn man is a thorn in my side." "So, what are you going to do about it?" "A good question, Danbury." For the first time, Proudfoot smiled with genuine warmth. "I rather think Dalhousie's doctrine can also be applied here. That will make things—" He paused before smiling wolfishly, "neater." "Does the Maharaja have no heir? I rather thought that was a requirement for us to be able to annex a state upon the death of its ruler." Jack was doing his best to show what little he knew of the doctrine named after Lord Dalhousie, the Governor-General who had first introduced it. He had listened carefully to the conversations of the other officers on the steamship that had brought him to Calcutta. If he recalled correctly, Dalhousie had decreed that when a ruler died without an heir, his state would be annexed and placed under direct British rule. It was a controversial policy that ignored the tradition of childless rulers adopting an heir, but men like Proudfoot and Dalhousie were not ones to let such a trivial matter stand in the way of ensuring the efficient government of the country. "Oh, he claims to have an heir." Proudfoot flapped his hand to wave away Jack's observation. "These princes breed like damn rabbits, whelping brats on any of the 1,000 harlots they have at their command. But I cannot believe for one moment that he's legitimate. The Maharaja knows the rules as well as anyone. He has concocted a cock-and-bull story about his wife dying in childbirth, which is all very tragic, I'm sure, but that doesn't mean I have to believe it. He would be a fool not to claim some bastard as his heir and ensure the line of succession, but he did not count on dealing with someone like me. I shall not be fooled." Jack scowled. "That would seem a little harsh, sir. What if this boy truly is the Maharajah's son?" "Well, what of it? I'm not here to mollycoddle some brat just because a damn fool tells me to. It will be neater for all of us if the state of Sawad is annexed. Then it too can fall under the control of the Bundelkhand Agency, and this circus can end. The Crown will rule here unfettered, Danbury. It really is better for us all." "So we are intent on the annexation?" "Of course. No matter if we have a legitimate right to do so or not." "I understand, Danbury. I am an Englishman too. But this isn't some damn game of cricket. We have to leave our sense of fair play back at home." Proudfoot looked suitably grave, as if the notion of unsportsmanlike conduct caused him pain. "They don't play by the rules out here, and so neither can we. If we turned our backs for an instant, then we leave ourselves open to revolt and anarchy. I will not allow that." "I understand, sir." Jack did his best to keep his voice level, hiding his true feelings. "Good fellow. It takes a while to become acclimatized to our ways out here on the frontier of the Empire. It's not the simple soldiering you have been used to. It requires a more subtle understanding of the people." "I'm sure it does." Jack's expression was neutral, but there was a trace of scorn in his tone. It was not lost on Proudfoot. "These things are rarely straightforward, Danbury. It's something you must learn to accept if you're to prosper here. The locals outnumber us by thousands to our every one. We must be strong in purpose. If they sense we're weak, then we're doomed. To maintain order, all I have is a company of the 24th, supported by 3 companies of the 12th Bengal Native Infantry, both stationed here in Bundapur, and a single squadron of the 1st Bengal Cavalry over at Fort St. John. A day's ride from here. Barely 500 men when the damn Maharajah has an army at least 20 times that size. Your men are the only British troops for hundreds of miles, and I rely on them to be the backbone of my forces. Lieutenant Fenris has been running things in your absence, and I commend him to you. He's a fine officer, and I expect you will be gratified to have him. I look forward to making up my own mind on that count." Proudfoot looked up sharply. He opened his mouth as if about to disagree before thinking better of it, contenting himself with a gentle shake of his head at his new subordinate's belligerence. "Major Dutton commands our contingent from the 12th. He has fashioned them into a fine body of men, although I expect you'll wish to make your own mind up about that, too." Proudfoot sneered, enjoying his own barbed rebuke. Jack smiled, unconcerned by the comment. "Indeed, I look forward to being able to inspect them." Proudfoot puffed his cheeks out. "That's not quite what I meant. Look here, Danbury. I'm very aware that many Queen's officers look down on those commissioned by the company, but I will not tolerate such arrogance here. We are united in our purpose, and I will not allow any prejudice to divert us." "You're quite right, sir. I merely meant that I'm keenly anticipating having the opportunity to see the 12th in the flesh." Jack's reply was polite, but there was little indication of apology in his expression. "Well, I suspect you'll get that opportunity shortly. I'm sure we will all be very gratified to have the opinion of an experienced soldier." Proudfoot's voice was icy. "Did you see any action in the Crimea?" "A little." A shiver ran down Jack's spine as he involuntarily recalled the storming of the great redoubt on the slopes overlooking the Alma River. The Russian gunners had mercilessly shredded the redcoats' ranks in a desperate bid to turn back the tide of men that marched so steadily towards them. The redcoats had ignored their fearsome casualties, advancing through the dreadful fire to take the redoubt. Jack had been in the front rank of the assault. "Good fellow." Proudfoot nodded his approval. "We need men of action here. Men who are not frightened of taking the opportunities presented to them. Men like us, Danbury. Men like us." He had leant forward as he had spoken, his passion obvious. Now he eased back in his chair as if the discussion had been exhausting. "Well, I am very pleased to find we are to have an experienced soldier with us. I sincerely hope we will not have need of your particular skills, but I shall not shrink from a fight if one is forced upon me. Now, we must get you settled in. I think it will help you if you share a bungalow with Fenris at the start. He has more than enough space. You can form a chummery until you get settled." Proudfoot plucked a small silver bell from the corner of his desk, ringing it with a single casual flick of the wrist. The door to the office was whipped open before the gentle sound had quite finished, the official's consummate marching smartly into the room and snapping to attention. "Show Captain Danbury to Lieutenant Fenris's bungalow." The two officers got to their feet, and Proudfoot walked quickly around the desk to shake Danbury by the hand, signalling the close of their meeting. "I shall send my steward to collect you for dinner." Proudfoot smiled, once more showing real warmth. "It's good you're here, Danbury. I have a feeling you will fit in nicely. We have need of men of good breeding and experience." Jack returned the smile, the irony of Proudfoot's words amusing. He might have had as much right to be there as a Maharajah's bastard had to claim a throne, but he was determined to make good his ambition and once again secure the life he craved. He had to, no matter what difficulties he faced. He had nothing else. Chapter 3. Jack sat alone in the darkened room, his eyes closed as he savoured the peace of solitude, his body enjoying the cool air that filtered through the wetted grass screens that covered the windows. His heavy scarlet uniform coat lay discarded on the simple iron bedstead that took up most of the space in the bungalow's single guest room to which he had been shown. He had arrived after the hour for tiffin, and so, much to his relief, the bungalow's other occupant, Lieutenant Fenris, was with his men, carrying out his afternoon duties now that luncheon and the worst of the day's heat was out of the way. With the cantonment's other officers and civilian officials working until late in the afternoon, Jack would be spared the strain of the necessary introductions until later. Proudfoot's dinner loomed large on the immediate horizon, yet for the moment, at least, he could shed the outer shell of the Queen's officer, revealing the man who dwelt beneath its protective folds. It was only at moments such as this that he allowed his thoughts to venture into the recesses of his mind that he kept closed off and secured when in company. He had not been lying when he told Major Proudfoot that it had been a long journey to Bundapur, but the official could not begin to imagine just how far he had come. His journey had begun in a hospital in Scutari. It was a hellish place, a disgrace that the British people were only just now becoming aware of, thanks to the candid eyewitness accounts arriving from William Russell of the Times. The newspapers Jack had been able to buy in Calcutta were full of Russell's reports, shocking tales of the suffering being endured by the wounded and sick soldiers left to rot in the fetid and squalid conditions found in the Allied hospital. In such an appalling environment, soldiers were dying at a terrifying rate, and there, in a quiet back room, James Danbury became one of them, his dreams of a future in India and a new life in the Queen's most striking colony dying with him. His only legacy had been an identity for a man becoming accustomed to a life of loneliness and guilt. For former orderly Jack Lark, Danbury's death had opened a path to a new future, a life as a captain in the 24th Regiment of Foot, an escape from a bitter past. Jack flapped his hand ineffectually at a fly that was buzzing around his face and poked into the murkiest corners of his mind, picking at the memories that festered in the darkness, remembering the past. He had once been rebuked for his lack of gumption, for failing to seize the opportunities life presented. He had loved the young woman who had delivered the reprimand, but she had died, and he had been left alone and without direction. In the awful hours following her death, Jack had been forced to leave the regiment that had been his home since he had joined the Redcoats, as he journeyed to war at the side of his master, Captain Arthur Sloames. But fate would not let him escape so easily. Sloames sickened and died, leaving Jack alone once more. Abandoned and bereft of any ties, he had embarked on his first charade, becoming the officer he had always dreamt of being, assuming the name and station of Captain Arthur Sloames, the commander of the light company in the King's Royal Fusiliers. He had been determined to prove that the product of London's poorest rookeries could be the equal of those born with the money and influence to purchase their rank, their place in society guaranteed by a respectable family and backed up by 3% government stock. He had done it, to prove to the girl who had loved him that she had not been wrong to choose him. As Sloames, Jack had led his men into the terrifying cauldron of battle, the vicious fight at the Alma River a proving ground for his ability as an officer. The harsh reality had made a mockery of his naive aspirations, the carnage of the battle washing away in a cascade of blood and horror any ambition he had once nurtured. Now, as he sat alone in the bungalow, Jack contemplated his future, seeking a way forward that would allow him to shrug off the shackles of his former life and carry the burden of guilt that had crushed his soul since the Alma. The setting sun lit the darkening sky with a fabulous display of red and ochre, the day's final vibrant celebration before the onrushing darkness laid claim to the baked land. The silent streets awoke as the burning heat faded, the inhabitants of the cantonment emerging from their sanctuaries. The town sprang back into life, the bustle and commotion of the early evening breathing life back into the sun-bleached streets. The British cantonment was separated from the city of Bundapur by a wide maidan, a broad sweep of ground that kept the administrators and enforcers of Her Majesty's will wholly apart from the town over which they held jurisdiction, the cultural divide manifest in half a mile of dusty scrub and parched soil. Facing the maidan was the row of officers' bungalows. Broadly spaced and immaculate in a coat of bright whitewash, the homes of the leaders of the British forces and the highest-ranked civil appointees enjoying a breathtaking view over the city. Neatly trimmed hedges and pristine rose gardens provided natural partitions between the houses. The complex web of irrigation channels that fed their gardens snaking backwards like umbilical cords linking the elegant greenery to the series of wells and bullock-powered pumps that drew the precious water from the deep underground. Large, dusty parade grounds provided plenty of space to drill the 4 companies of infantry under Proudfoot's command. A firing ground on the side of the cantonment furthest from the town allowed the red-coated infantry to train away from the prying eyes of the ever-watchful sentries standing guard on the high stone wall that had protected Bundapur from attack for centuries. Behind the row of officers' bungalows were the barracks for the British redcoats. Wide, airy rooms with high ceilings and tall windows, surrounded by a broad veranda, allowed the Queen's soldiers to live in comfort, even in the blistering heat. The smaller, darker barracks of the native troops were pushed well to the western edge of the cantonment, the sepoy kept apart even from the lowliest of British redcoats. The cantonment was an ordered, very English haven for the men stationed in this distant corner of the British Empire. It allowed them to live a life apart from the population they governed, immune to the precarious nature of their situation. For they were surrounded and alone, outnumbered by thousands to their every one. Yet they carried on with their lives as if they were in the peaceful English countryside and not close to the wild frontier of the empire, self-satisfied and complacent, even as the storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Jack tugged hard at the hem of his scarlet jacket, straightening the creases that had formed as he walked the short distance to Major Proudfoot's bungalow. Even in the cooler evening air, he was sweating, the cotton handkerchief he had brought with him already sodden from constant wiping across his face. The thick uniform was wholly unsuited to the Indian climate, yet the army made no allowances, so the Queen's officers sweated their way through their duties, their cotton shirts needing to be changed many times a day lest the stench offend the noses of any who ventured near. Gentle laughter reached Jack's ears, the clink of the cut crystal clearly audible over the constant clicking and calling of the vast multitude of insects that prowled and fluttered through the darkness. He closed his eyes as he tried to summon the willpower to face the company that had assembled to greet the newly arrived officer. The polite cough of the khansamah forced him to open his eyes. Jack smiled as he saw the discreet servant looking back at him. As much as he would wish it differently, it was time to play the part he had chosen. So, like an actor striding from the wings, he nodded to the patient servant and walked towards the gathering with as much determination as he could muster. "Danbury, welcome!" Proudfoot stood at the top of the steps that led up to the porch at the front of his large bungalow. As cordial as his words were, Jack detected a trace of annoyance in his commander's voice, as if he had been waiting with growing impatience for his new captain to belatedly appear. "Do come in. I have a number of people here anxious to meet you." The Major held out an arm, ushering Jack inside the brightly lit bungalow. Proudfoot had once again eschewed military attire, favouring a close-fitting dinner jacket of the deepest red with an intricate web of gold thread swirling over the breast. A thick white cravat was wrapped tightly around his neck, forcing his chin upwards, so that he peered down his nose as Jack strode quickly up the steps and into the light. "Welcome, Danbury, welcome," repeated Proudfoot, shaking Jack warmly by the hand, his grip dry and cool, despite the heat. He held the handshake and leant forward to speak softly into Jack's ear. "The regimentals are all well and good in Calcutta, Danbury, old man, but out here you really must look to adapt. I'll set you up with my tailor. He's a fine chap for a local. We'll have you kitted out properly in a jiffy. Now," he pulled back and smiled, all trace of his former irritation gone, "let's get on with it, shall we?" The sea of faces turned in unison as Jack was led into the bungalow's generously proportioned drawing room. With its high ceiling, the room felt airy and cool, an effect enhanced by the tint of green added to the whitewash that had been meticulously applied to the walls. The windows had been covered by the sort of thin wire mesh screens more usually seen in a butcher's shop back in England, a defence against the multitude of insects drawn by the room's bright lights. Jack was surprised to see no grass tatties at the windows, yet the room felt surprisingly cool, although the air was ripe with the pungent perfume of the few ladies present, the heady aromas vying for dominance with all the vigour of a Russian skirmish line. A pair of strange contraptions had been built around two of the drawing-room's windows. Jack supposed these were a pair of the new-fangled thermantidotes that were all the rage for cooling the air in the more fashionable homes in Calcutta. The clever combination of air funnels, fans, and water-soaked screens did not come cheap. Proudfoot was clearly a man of means. Jack did his best to hide his nerves as he looked around the small congregation, bobbing his head in acknowledgement of the attention directed towards him. Disappointingly, the strangers were just as he had expected. The flushed and rounded faces of the officials, their chins bulging over starched collars that constricted their wide necks and forced their spare chins into thick ribbons of flesh under their jaws, the confident appraisal of the junior officers as they sized up the new arrival and wondered what competition they faced, the guarded eyes of the women as they surreptitiously inspected his lean body, any desire hidden behind a dignified facade of insouciant respectability. He let himself be led into the throng, his heart beating faster. He knew that the challenge of maintaining his deception would be at its greatest with people born into the world in which he had intruded. He had declined the invitations he had received whilst waiting for his transport to be arranged for precisely that reason, unwilling to test his ability to carry off his assumed identity, even in the transient society of Calcutta. Now that he was in Bundapur, such situations could not be avoided, and he did his best to look composed, even as his bowels twisted with apprehension. He might be able to convince officers on campaign or passengers on peninsular and oriental steamer that he knew what he was about, but this was the first time he had encountered such a social gathering. He would rather face a column of Russian infantry than converse with a middle-aged spinster who would seize upon any lack of social grace with relish. A drawing-room of ageing Englishmen and women was as much a threat to his continued survival as a battlefield, and twice as complicated. He pushed the fears away and fixed his expression into what he hoped was a friendly smile, doing his best to acknowledge the greetings directed towards him. The faces passed in a blur, the nods and smiles merging into one. Among the surging throng, he caught a glimpse of a younger face, belonging to a blonde girl who stood out like an eagle in a pigeon coop. A pair of green eyes matched his appraisal with a confident, mocking stare, before she was hidden from view by the meaty shoulders of the matronly figure being ushered towards him on the arm of a portly, grey-bearded gentleman dressed in full regimentals. "Danbury, let me introduce you to Major Dutton." Proudfoot took Jack by the elbow, propelling him towards the commander of the contingent from the 12th Bengal Native Infantry. "Dutton." The Major's handshake was as curt and abrupt as his introduction of his wife. "Hilary." "Danbury, I'm pleased to meet you both." Jack hoped his words conveyed an enthusiasm he did not feel. The Major's wife had an ample bosom, artlessly displayed by a shoulderless dress of vivid scarlet that clung precariously to her many folds and creases. Jack had enough time to notice Proudfoot slipping away as the introductions were made before he was forced to cock an ear in what he hoped was a sign of encouragement as Mrs. Dutton started to speak. "How was your journey, Captain Danbury? It's such a long way from Calcutta." Dutton's wife smiled as she spoke, but there was no hiding the salacious appraisal she gave or the sparkle in her eyes as she savoured what she saw. "Enough of your mothering, my dear." Dutton interrupted his wife, saving Jack from a meaningless reply about heat, bullock carts and interminable delays. He took an immediate liking to the blunt officer. "The man will have had his fill of damned travelling. Is that not so, Danbury?" "Indeed," Jack replied politely, doing his best to smile reassuringly at Mrs. Dutton as she shrank away from the conversation, her husband's authority clear. "Ready for some real soldiering, I expect." Dutton smiled wolfishly at the notion, revealing an array of discoloured teeth. "All this shilly-shallying around takes its toll on a man, what?" "Quite true." Dutton leant forward to speak in a confiding whisper. "I could see you were a man of action as soon as I clapped eyes on you. How was the Crimea? Did you see much action?" Little." "Say no more. I can see it in your eyes. I have not had the occasion myself, not been that lucky." Dutton failed to hide his obvious disappointment at having been denied the opportunity to hear the guns roar in anger on a battlefield. Jack did not know how to reply. Was the Major unlucky not to have fought a battle, or simply fortunate? The horror he himself had experienced at the Alma should have made that an easy question to answer. Yet he could well remember his own desire to fight, to experience the hardest challenge a soldier could face. He might wish with all his soul that the battle had not happened, but he could not deny the pride he felt at having taken part. Dutton watched him closely, nodding as if in approval at the distant look that came over the new captain. "There is unlikely to be any fighting here. More's the damn pity." Jack forced his mind away from his memories. "Truly? What of this Maharajah?" "The Maharajah's a fool. He surrounds himself with his fancy lancers and thinks of himself as a great warrior chief. But I tell you this, Danbury, if he were ever to be foolish enough to challenge us, we would tear his ragtag little army to pieces in a heartbeat. No, there will be no battles here. At least none that Mr. Russell of the Times would find of note." Jack nodded in agreement. He had read Russell's accounts of the fighting in the Crimea. The papers he had been able to find on the journey were always long out of date, but he believed Russell was giving a fair account of the campaign. The reporter was certainly no fool or lickspittle, offering his share of criticism of General Raglan and the army's leadership, much of which Jack fully agreed with. It was hard to imagine anything happening in the forgotten kingdom of Sawad that would catch any journalist's attention. However, he was intrigued to hear the Major write off the Maharajah's army with such certainty. "I was led to understand we were heavily outnumbered here," he said. "Surely that would count for something." "Outnumbered we are, that is true. And it is enough to keep all those damn peacocks hissing in their breeches at the very thought." Dutton could not hide his look of distaste as he used his drink to gesture around the room. Of all the officers present, only he and Jack were in their regimental uniforms, the rest preferring an array of vibrantly coloured costumes, as if there was a silent competition to wear the most garish or the most outlandish garb. "But I would back my 300 against 3,000 of the Maharajahs," he continued, fixing Jack with a hard stare as he dared the Queen's officer to gainsay him. Jack kept his expression neutral, even if there was something concerning in the Major's blind confidence. He was saved from any further reply as Proudfoot reappeared at his elbow. "Come, Danbury. More people to meet." He was keen to steer Jack onwards, towards the next step on his tour of introductions. "Come and visit us when you're settled, Danbury. I would like you to run your eyes over my men," Dutton proposed as Proudfoot led Jack away. "They're good boys. They would give a solid account of themselves if ever the need arose. They would fight hard. Damned hard." Jack heard the longing in Dutton's voice. The man was clearly desperate for a fight. With Proudfoot so keen to annex the Maharajah's lands, it made for a dangerous combination. If the Maharajah didn't back down, then a fight was inevitable. Political machinations would give way to violence, and men like Dutton would be handed the authority to force home the Queen's will. Chapter 4. "Reverend, our new captain." Proudfoot's instructions had got shorter as he promenaded his new subordinate around the room, his sentences eroding as rapidly as his enthusiasm. For Jack, the procession of introductions had passed by in a blur of names, firm handshakes and meaningless nothings. The station at Bundapur was small, little more than an outpost of the British Empire, yet it still boasted half a dozen commissioned officers from the Honourable East India Company, with at least that number again of civil appointees, along with their associated wives and relations. Jack had now gained some knowledge of the people with whom he would live in the coming months, It would take much longer to understand and follow the complex web of power that would govern life in the cantonment. His short time in India had taught him that social standing was guarded as jealously as a Maharajah's treasure. To commit a social faux pas, however unintentional, was to court disgrace. Not for the first time he wondered at the sanity of his decision to force himself into a world in which he did not belong. "I'm delighted to meet you, Captain. Now tell me, are you a bass, baritone, or has the good Lord finally delivered me a tenor?" "Don't start bothering Danbury with your choir already, Reverend. The poor fellow's only just arrived." Proudfoot's disdain for the portly chaplain was painfully obvious in his icy manner. "Now, Danbury, I'll leave you with Reverend young Summers." The Major was keen to be away, and Jack was glad to see him go. Being paraded around the room like a prize heifer had been uncomfortable enough, and he did not think he would have been able to stand Proudfoot's tugging on his elbow for another minute without his temper snapping. Reverend young Summers gently patted his ample stomach as Proudfoot made his excuses, a soft belch escaping a wide, fleshy mouth that gave him an unfavourable comparison with a toad. The clergyman's aged black jacket strained at the buttons as it struggled to encompass his bulk, its thick shoulders and wide collar liberally covered with flakes of fallen scurf. "You've no drink." Young Summers' disapproval was clear. "Let me remedy that tragedy." He lifted his left hand, clicking his fingers towards one of the many serving staff standing like statues against the walls, then pointed to his own empty glass and raised 2 fingers. In the time it took him to turn back to face Jack, 2 fresh glasses of brandy and soda arrived in the hands of the servant charged with supplying this corner of the room with a ready supply of alcohol. "There you go. A quick peg before dinner. Proudfoot may lack taste, but he keeps a good table and a tolerable cellar. You will find, Danbury, that one needs a good diet in this infernal heat. It's the only way to survive." Young Summers's eyes narrowed in anticipation at the thought of food. From his sizable girth, it was clear that the chaplain enthusiastically followed his own advice. "I shall do my best," Jack replied, trying not to smile at the odd creature in front of him. Young Summers raised his glass to his mouth and drained it in 2 huge gulps. "I shall introduce you to my daughter." He turned to bring a slight, blonde-haired girl into the conversation, careless of the trickle of brandy that crept from the corner of his mouth to stain the once white dog collar that was fighting to remain fixed around his bulbous neck. "Isabel, this is Danbury, the 24th's new captain." The girl who had caught Jack's eye when he first entered the room now stood in front of him, offering a brief curtsy before fixing him with the same mocking, mischievous green eyes. Jack's weariness left him in a heartbeat. "Captain Danbury." Isabel had to lift her chin high to maintain eye contact. She was slimmer than Jack had imagined from his single glimpse of her. The simple green dress she wore shimmered in the candlelight, matching both the colour and the sparkle in her eyes. She was captivating. "Isabel has come to visit me before going to live with her aunt in Truro. I selfishly wanted her all to myself one last time." Reverend young Summers looked at his daughter fondly, reaching out to pat her gloved hand with affection. "Now, Papa, you know full well that we have not yet fixed my plans." Jack watched as he saw the full weight of Isabel's charm brought to bear on her father. If Reverend young Summers had the willpower to send his daughter back to England, then he was a better man than Jack was. "We shall see, my dear, we shall see. Do you have family, Danbury?" "No, sir. I am quite alone in the world." Jack was doing his best not to stare. Isabel was beautiful. He could see now that her hair was redder than he had first thought, a touch of ginger amidst the blonde curls that were artfully styled in what he supposed was the latest fashion. "Then you cannot know a father's pain." Young Summers frowned as he saw that the new captain was clearly charmed by his daughter. "You desire nothing more than for your precious child to remain with you always. Yet you know you must let them go if they are to live the life you desire for them." He spoke wistfully, careless of revealing his emotions to a stranger. "Perhaps Captain Danbury will know that one day, Papa." Isabel ignored her father, focusing all her charm on the new officer, who blushed at her attention. "He is much too young to be thinking of making a family." She gave Jack a teasing smile, making the most oblique reference to procreation sound like an invitation to dive into the nearest bedroom. "I am not so young." Isabel was so vibrant that Jack could not resist studying her face as he addressed her. It was a delight, her features slim and elegant, yet it was her hair that charmed him the most, with its unruly curls that fanned around her face. She had tried to tame the wildest sections with narrow metal clips, each decorated with a single glass bead that encompassed every hue in the rainbow. In the gentle light of the room they flickered as her head moved, a vivid kaleidoscope of vibrant colour. "Nonsense! Why, you cannot be more than 22, Isabel mocked, her eyes narrowing provocatively as she estimated his age. Isabel's beauty had transported Jack into his past, his mind returning to the memory of another young woman. It had been many months, but the pain of her death was still fresh. Isabel pouted at his lack of reaction. "There, I have offended you by speaking of age." "Now, my dear, I very much doubt if Captain Danbury would be so easily put out. Is that not so, Danbury?" Jack had to force his mind back to the present. "Indeed." He heard the coldness in his own voice and saw Isabel purse her lips as though considering something. "Perhaps Captain Danbury would like to join us on our expedition the day after tomorrow, Papa. It would allow us to get to know him better before Major Proudfoot buries him in work." "A capital notion." Young Summers signalled for another drink as he approved his daughter's suggestion. "Danbury, we have a long-awaited opportunity to visit a local wonder. Isabel likes nothing better than a chance to explore some of the crumbling, dusty edifices that seem to appeal to the local peasants. She has a rum idea of it being a fitting occupation for a young woman. I expect she gets that from her mother, my late wife." His mouth turned down at the corners as if he had tasted something sour. He gulped at his fresh drink, which had been brought by the willing servant, using the brandy and soda to scour the bitterness from his mouth. "I believe I noticed the tower you speak of on my way here." Jack tried to sound gracious as he attempted to make good his escape. As pleasing as it would be to have a day out with the delightful Isabel, he would rather rub his arse with a brick before he spent time with her father. "I would dearly like the chance to explore it, but I'm not sure that will be possible for the moment. I must attend to my new command." "I'm sure Proudfoot would see the benefit." Young Summers used his hand to stifle another deep belch. "And as you will discover, Danbury, my daughter tends to get what she desires. I doubt even Proudfoot has the wherewithal to gainsay her." Isabel's eyes flushed with triumph. "There, it is settled. You shall come." "Who will go where?" Their conversation was interrupted by the urbane tones of an English officer. "Am I missing out on the social outing of the season?" "Arthur, we are merely inviting Captain Danbury to join us on our excursion to the mysterious Tower of Silence that I have told you about countless times." "Lucky fellow." The officer turned so that he was face to face with Jack. "So you're Danbury. I'm pleased to meet you. I'm Arthur Fenris." Jack looked into the face of his subordinate, taking in the cool, mocking stare. Fenris was far too comfortable for a lieutenant meeting his captain for the first time, and Jack wondered what license the man had been given as he awaited his new commander. Believing his introduction to be complete, Fenris turned his charisma back on Isabel. "So, when was I to be invited?" His playful tone made it clear there was no censure intended by the rebuke. As he spoke, Fenris angled his body, subtly but effectively pushing Jack to the fringe of the conversation. "Don't be a ninny, Arthur. Of course you're invited." "Well, I'm not certain I wish to accompany you now," Fenris teased. "You will have no need of 2 heroes to guard you." "A lady can never have enough heroes." Isabel lifted her chin in what Jack believed was a gesture of defiance. It was clear the Reverend's daughter was used to getting her own way. Isolated on the periphery of the conversation, Jack had a moment to study his new subaltern. Lieutenant Fenris had the build and stature of a hunter. He was taller than Jack, with the broad shoulders and narrow waist of someone who valued their appearance and took measures to maintain it. With an unruly mop of black hair and a pair of thick mutton-chop whiskers, it was easy to understand why Isabel was so clearly entranced. If his physique were not enough, then Fenris's choice of dress would turn many a maiden's head. He wore a long jacket of cream linen that hung to his thighs, coupled with a pair of tight-cut trousers in the same fabric. The plainness of the suit contrasted with his bright blue waistcoat, decorated with fabulous swirls and stitching picked out in a bronze thread. Around the neck of his white linen shirt he wore a cravat of plain gold, held in place with a single pin topped with a fat pearl. Every cantonment had its dandy, and it was clear that Jack Subaltern relished the role at Bundapur. "So, what of it, Danbury? Shall we both squire Miss Young Summers?" Fenris spoke in jocular tones, yet it did not endear him to Jack. He was not alone in finding the presence of the young lieutenant grating, and Reverend Young Summers politely excused himself from the conversation as he continued his pursuit of exhausting Proudfoot's supply of brandy. "I shall go, but you shall stay here," said Jack, irritated by Fenris's peremptory manner. "I would not want to leave the men without either of their officers." "I beg your pardon." There was a flash of anger in the younger officer's eyes as his new captain pulled rank. "If we're to get along, I suggest you see the surgeon and get your ears cleaned out. Tomorrow I plan to inspect the men before we conduct a morning of drill followed by an afternoon at musket practice. I want to see how well they can shoot. I would be grateful if you can make the necessary arrangements." Fenris looked as if he had swallowed a turd. "Are those your orders, sir?" He appeared to gag on the title, as if speaking the word caused him physical pain. Isabel inched closer, her eyes sparkling with enjoyment at the tension between the two men. "They are. What is the name of the colour sergeant?" "That would be Colour Sergeant Hughes, sir," Fenris replied with a healthy dollop of sarcasm. "Please let him know I shall want to see him first thing in the morning." "Have you cleared this with Major Proudfoot?" Fenris sneered as he spoke, his anger at being so openly treated as a subordinate obvious. Jack felt his own anger flare. "I do not need the permission of the Major to run my command as I see fit. Do not presume to question me again, is that clear?" Fenris opened his mouth as if to argue further. He controlled himself with some difficulty. "Abundantly clear, sir." Jack felt the need for fresh air. Despite Proudfoot's antidotes, the room felt stuffy, and the perfume-rich air caught in his throat. With the briefest of nods, he excused himself and made for the door. The smirk he glimpsed on Isabel's face did nothing to improve his mood. He had not given Fenris a dressing down for her benefit. Jack would get his command into shape, and if that required upsetting his callow prig of a lieutenant, then that was a small price to pay. Jack jogged down the steps of the bungalow, sucking in a huge lungful of the clean night air. It was a relief to be free. The long evening spent standing in the confines of Proudfoot's drawing room had awakened the recurring pain in his back, and he needed to find somewhere to sit in peace so that he could try to knead the ache away. "Danbury!" His spine stiffened as he recognised the drawled tones calling for his attention. "Stop there, I say!" Jack forced his tiredness away and turned to face a red-faced Fenris who was galloping down the steps behind him. "Damn you, Danbury! What makes you think you can talk to me like that?" Fenris opened his tirade while still several paces away from where Jack had stopped. "You will call me sir when you address me." Jack spoke in calm, measured tones, as if addressing a recalcitrant child. His captain's sang-froid did nothing to calm Fenris down. "I shall not, you damned blackguard! How dare you? Speaking to me in such a way in front of Miss Young Summers was disgraceful. I should bloody well call you out." Jack's temper started to fray. "You will address me correctly at all times, and you will be dressed in your regulation uniform when you do so. I will not tolerate an officer in my company going around dressed as some damn nabob. Go to hell. When Major Proudfoot hears of this, I don't give a damn what Proudfoot says," Jack interrupted with real venom in his voice. "You are under my command, not his. You will conduct yourself as I see fit." "Damn your eyes, Danbury." Jack reached forward and grabbed Fenris around the arm, pulling the officer forward so his face was inches from his own. "Listen to me, Lieutenant. I have no intention of letting a mewling turd under my command tell me what I should or should not do." Fenris sneered, despite the naked threat in Jack's eyes. "Now, look here, Danbury." He tried to pull out of Jack's grip, but couldn't break free from the vice-like hold. "I have fought and killed until my arm felt like lead, and then I fought and killed some more." Jack snarled his words into Fenris's face. "I have watched the horror on a man's face when he realizes he is going to die. If you choose to fight me, then I will strike you down." He released his hold on the lieutenant's arm, throwing it away abruptly so that Fenris staggered backwards. The younger officer's face twisted into a snarl, and he took a pace forwards. Jack saw the violence in his subaltern's eyes, the shame and the anger burning brightly in his face. He braced himself for a wild rush, his muscles tensing as his body took control, an icy calm flowing through him as he prepared to fight. Then Fenris turned, his attention taken by the sounds of a hushed and appalled audience. Jack looked past his shaken lieutenant and saw for the first time the large crowd that had gathered at the top of the steps. The look of delighted horror on the fascinated faces made it clear that they had been watching the two officers the whole time as they bawled at each other like a pair of feuding costermongers. Standing at the front of the group, Major Proudfoot caught Jack's eye. Then, with a slow shake of his head, he ushered his guests back inside. Jack turned and walked away, heedless of the eyes boring into his spine. He did not care if he caused a scandal that would be the talk of the cantonment. Soldiers deserved the best officers, and Jack would not allow them to be commanded by some upper-class popinjay who simply fancied the gold braid and being called sir. Fenris would have to learn that lesson, no matter how painful it might prove. Chapter 5. Jack was dressed and out of the chummery before he even heard Fenris begin to stir. He had no intention of repeating the previous night's conversation. He did not regret anything he had said, but he wanted to start his first day in the cantonment without the bitter tang of acrimony in the air. "Good morning, sir. Can I help you?" A young corporal greeted him as he approached the 24th's line. "Good morning, Corporal. I'm looking for Colour Sergeant Hughes." The corporal looked anxious, despite the politely worded request. "I'll go and fetch him for you, sir. If you'd just wait there." Jack sensed he was being treated with caution. The young corporal was clearly nervous at being faced by his new company commander, and keen to hold him off until the company's senior non-commissioned officer could be summoned to deal with him. "What's your name, Corporal?" The corporal looked twice as worried. "Jones, sir." Jack nodded and tried to smile in what he hoped was a reassuring way. "I can hear from your voice that you're from Wales. Which part?" "Brecon, sir." Corporal Jones had been trying to move away, but now hovered in an awkward position, half at attention. "I'll get Colour Sergeant Hughes now, shall I, sir?" Jack nodded firmly as he realised he was torturing the younger man. "Carry on, Corporal Jones." The young corporal scampered away. Jack used the time to look around the company lines. The pathways between the barracks and the rest of the cantonment were well cared for, the gravel neatly raked and the stones that marked them out recently whitewashed. It spoke well of the company's non-commissioned officers, and he hoped that the rest of the company was as well turned out. "Good morning, sir. You must be Captain Danbury." The calm voice interrupted Jack's quiet inspection, and he turned to see a tall, barrel-chested redcoat marching towards him. The crowned Union Jack and crossed swords above the chevrons of a sergeant identified the man wearing them as Colour Sergeant Hughes. Jack instinctively felt a prickle of unease. He had been an ordinary redcoat for too long not to feel troubled coming face to face with the company's senior sergeant. "Good morning, Colour Sergeant. I must apologise for not being here to greet you. You're early, if you don't mind my saying so, sir. Mr. Fenris told me to expect you this morning, but he didn't say it would be this early." Jack's brow furrowed at the statement, even though it was delivered in a friendly enough tone. "I think this is quite late enough. We have a lot to do this morning. We will start with morning parade. Then I want to watch the men at their drill. Did Lieutenant Fenris explain that they are to attend a firing practice at the range later?" "He did indeed, sir. Everything's been prepared, and the men are ready to be inspected at your convenience." Jack smiled. He had the feeling he would get on well with this businesslike colour sergeant. The relationship was an important one. It was a foolish or naive officer who did not understand that he needed the full support of his NCOs. Officers might wear the scarlet and lace, but it was the experienced sergeants and corporals who were the real leaders of the company. Without them, no officer could ever hope to be an effective commander. "I'm looking forward to seeing the men." Jack spoke briskly as he began to take charge. He was revelling in being back at the head of a company. He had missed it more than he had believed possible. "I hope they can shoot as well as they paint." He nodded to the whitewashed stones by his feet. "The boys can shoot all right, sir. We haven't seen neither hide nor hair of the new Enfield, but I would wager we'll meet your expectations with our muskets." "Very good." Jack was intrigued. He had heard some talk of the army's new rifle. In the Crimea, his men had used the Minié rifle. Against the Russian conscript, it had proved itself to be a dreadfully effective weapon. The heavy bullets capable of tearing through successive ranks in the dense enemy formation. The cleverly designed bullets deformed when they were fired, allowing them to grip the grooves in the rifle's barrel as well as ensuring that little of the explosive power of the cartridge was lost. If the new Enfield was a superior weapon, then it was going to give the Redcoats a huge advantage. His new command still used the percussion cap musket. It was an old-fashioned weapon, and his men would have to excel at their drill if they were to make up for its lack of range and power. I saw the effect of the Minier in the Crimea. Jack was enjoying being back amongst fellow redcoats. It was a relief to talk about the merits of rifles rather than endure the polite yet trivial small talk of society. It certainly proved its worth there. "Oh, I'm sure it's a good weapon, sir. But the men aren't so sure. They like their muskets. They don't see the need for change. If it was good enough for them boys at Waterloo, then it's good enough for us." Well, Jack did his best to ignore the traditional inertia of the redcoats. I shall certainly enjoy seeing them shoot. For now, please order them on parade. Hugh stamped to attention and flashed Jack a solid salute. "Yes, sir." Jack felt a rush of emotion as he acknowledged the salute. It had been too long since he had given orders. He felt the shackles falling away. He was back where he belonged, doing a job he loved. He was home. Jack heard the heavy tramp of feet on the wooden veranda outside the office. He lifted his head from the company's books as he listened to the raised voice berating an unfortunate Corporal Jones. He recognised it at once. He held back the flash of temper he felt flare inside. The morning had gone well. The men of his new company had impressed him, both with their turnout and with their drill. He had left them to prepare for the day ahead and burrowed his way into the books, trying to commit to memory the names and histories of the men now under his command. It had been slow going. He was not a fast reader, and it had been difficult to decipher the company clerk's tight script. But he had been enjoying himself as he started the vital process of getting to know the men. Now Lieutenant Fenris had deigned to appear, and Jack knew he would not be left in peace for much longer. Sure enough, a flushed face appeared at the door to the company office. "May I ask what the deuce is going on here?" Fenris stalked into the small room and stood in front of the desk where Jack sat, carefully closing the thick ledger he had been studying. "Good morning, Lieutenant. Please shut the door and take a seat." Fenris turned and slammed the door. He did not sit, but stood at Jack's desk, his hands held petulantly on his hips. "Now, look here, Danbury." Jack did not let him continue. "Sit down." He gave the order with all the force of a man who had commanded in battle. Fenris's mouth snapped shut with an audible click. Jack thought he would ignore the order, but with a visible effort at controlling himself, he managed to pull up a chair and take a seat, vibrating with barely suppressed anger. "Captain Danbury," Fenris's voice was icy, "might I remind you that I have been in charge of this company for the past 6 months. I appreciate you wish to assume command." He choked on the word, but managed to carry on. "But I must ask that you give me the respect I am due, and allow me to continue to run the company until you are in a position to understand how things are done here." Jack was battling his temper. It would be easy to unleash the tirade he felt building inside him, but he was the senior officer. He had to think of the men first. It would harm the company if its 2 officers were at loggerheads. As much as he would enjoy tearing another strip off his lieutenant, he had to give the younger man a way back. "Lieutenant Fenris, I rather think we've got off on the wrong foot. Major Proudfoot has told me that you are to be commended for your time in command of the company. From what I have seen, he's quite correct." Fenris preened at the praise. "Then more reason to let me run things until you are settled." Jack swallowed hard. It was becoming clear that Fenris possessed neither the wit nor the intelligence to seize the olive branch he was offering. "I'm quite capable of getting to work right away. I would like to think you would assist me in that. I think you are wrong. You seek to undermine me, as you showed in front of Miss Young Summers. Jack understood that they had reached the heart of the problem. Fenris did not care about the command of the company. He cared about his image, about the loss of face in front of the most beautiful girl in the cantonment. Your behaviour was at fault, Lieutenant. I do not apologise for what I said, but perhaps I should have let it wait until this morning. Damn right! You made me look a fool. That was not my intention. Then you should be more bloody careful what you say. Jack sat back in his chair. He suddenly felt weary. I think we have said enough on this matter. I will consider it closed. Fenris scowled. Very well. As you have apologised, I shall be a gentleman and look to forget the matter. He stood quickly, tossing his head with clear disdain. I shall order Hughes to parade the men. There is no need. Jack opened the ledger, using the lines of names as a balm to his temper. I've paraded the men already. They're getting ready for the firing range. Fenris glowered. Did you not think to wait for me to arrive? Good God, this is too much, Danbury. Too much indeed. His face was colouring as he began to rage. I was willing to overlook your behaviour last evening, but now it appears you're determined to cut me out of the company. I shall not stand for such treatment. You may outrank me, but I think you will see differently once I've spoken to Proudfoot. I do not know who you think you are, swanking in here as if you own the place, but let me tell you, I shall not be easily brushed aside. My father— Jack slammed his hand onto the desk, cutting his subaltern off in mid-sentence before he rose to his feet, his face like thunder. Enough! He roared the single word, his attempts to curb his temper failing. You forget who you are talking to, Lieutenant. His voice was scornful as he emphasised the rank. I suggest you return to your quarters and calm yourself down. Fenris looked stunned. You are dismissing me? You leave me no choice. Jack sat back down heavily and turned his attention back to the company ledger, doing his best to calm the tremble in his hands. Fenris was speechless. He managed a snort of contempt before he spun on his heel and stomped out of the room. Jack tried to concentrate on the list of names of the men under his command, but his heart was pounding and he couldn't see anything other than a blur. He got to his feet, suddenly needing to move, and stalked to the window. A grass screen covered it, and he stood in the gentle breeze wafting through the tightly woven fibres. "Excuse me, sir. A visitor for you." Jack turned as Corporal Jones tentatively stuck his head around the door to the office. From the Welshman's expression, it was clear he had heard every word of the altercation. Jack sighed. He was in no mood to be civil. He knew he was expected to call on all the officers and senior officials and their wives in his first days in the cantonment. He hated obeying such expectations, but he had thought he would be given a few days to get settled before he would have to start receiving visitors and planning his own social engagements. Very well. Show him in. Jones blushed. It's a her, sir. I rather fancy you'll be pleased." The corporal retreated quickly, giving his new captain no time to reply. Isabel Young Summers appeared in the doorway. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you, Captain." Jack felt his temper disappear in a waft of French perfume. Not at all." He rushed around the desk, kicking against its side as his haste made him clumsy. "Please, take a seat." He pulled out the chair recently vacated by Fenris. "No, thank you. I must not stay. I have no chaperone." Jack coloured. "Of course." "I simply wish to inquire whether you have any particular requests for tomorrow's picnic." Jack was left standing uncomfortably close to Isabel, holding the chair awkwardly, as if using it as a shield to keep them apart. He let go and retreated to his own side of the desk. "No, thank you, I eat anything," he blurted, then kicked himself. He sounded like a greedy schoolboy. Isabel simply smiled. "That is easy, then. My father insists on taking enough food to feed the 5,000, just in case, as it were." For the first time, Jack sensed the young woman's own awkwardness. He realised she was here on a pretence, her question of no consequence whatsoever. The idea that she had just come to see him pleased him enormously. "It's kind of you to think of me." Isabel blushed. The flush spread up from the nape of her neck, and Jack had to fight the urge to stare. "Until tomorrow, then?" He couldn't think of anything to say, so he ended the conversation with regret. Isabel said nothing as she turned and left him alone once more. But the smell of her perfume lingered, the delicate fragrance reminding Jack of her presence. Perhaps he would look forward to the next day's exploration after all. Chapter 6. "There it is!" Isabel squealed in delight as she pointed ahead. Silhouetted against the skyline, the rough-hewn stone tower stood like a beacon, calling to the hot and dusty party that was struggling to climb the rocky pathway leading to the crest of the rough, craggy slope, just as it had called to the thousands before them. A dozen birds of prey circled around the tower's summit, drifting and soaring on eddies of warm air that swirled around the hilltop on which it had been built. Its sides were pitted and scarred, the cracks and fissures evidence of the trial of standing through the centuries, buffeted by storms and lashed by the monsoon rains. Most of the slopes around it showed the signs of attempts at cultivation, generations of farmers working tirelessly to grow a meagre crop in the thin soil. Yet none encroached near the tower, and a wide band of desolate scrub surrounded the tall spire, as if it had sucked all the goodness from the ground, like a leech sucking the blood from an open wound. The slopes below the tower were blanketed with the simple mud and thatch houses of the people who tried to eke out an existence far from the main towns. Herds of goats wandered the hillside, their pitiful bleats and cries the only sound disturbing the peace of the high ground. The local people relied on their herds for food. The arid, dusty soil was of little use to any inclined to farm. The animals' tireless search for nourishment made the surrounding hills all the more desolate, the few shrubs that clung to life little more than thorny twigs, any trace of greenery stripped away by the goats' relentless foraging. Jack tried to find some enthusiasm now that the tower was finally in sight. It was something of a relief to have escaped his difficult subaltern for the day. He had not spoken to Lieutenant Fenris since the previous morning, any further unpleasantness avoided at least for the moment. His body was less relieved. His backside was sore after hours spent in the saddle, the constant motion of the horse waking the pain in his back that sent spasms racing up and down his spine. He was not an accomplished rider, the skill only recently acquired since arriving in India as a necessity for his journey up from Calcutta. His proficiency had been sorely tested by the long ride into the hills, and now his aching, cramping muscles were threatening to give up completely. Despite the discomfort, He had to admit that riding the horse borrowed from Proudfoot's extensive stables was preferable to the strength-sapping march the men of his escort had endured. Proudfoot had insisted that the young Summers should have protection from the bandits and dacoits that plagued the more remote corners of his domain. The 10 men from Dutton's native infantry contingent had marched in silence. The only words Jack had heard from any of them were the commands issued by the havildar who led them. The sepoys wore a uniform similar to that of their British counterparts. The famous red jacket was the same, the 5 rows of braid across the front and around the cuffs as smart as anything seen in the barracks of England. In their working dress, the native infantrymen wore baggy white knee-length breeches in place of the more usual dark blue trousers, and whilst the British infantry still wore the traditional shako that had been a hallmark of the redcoat for centuries, the native troops wore a soft white Kilmarnock cap, much more suited to the heat of the relentless Indian sun. Instead of the thick leather stock worn around the neck to force the wearer to adopt a soldierly bearing, the native soldiers wore beads or went bare-necked, much to the frustration of the British redcoats, whose uniforms bore no adaptation for the harsh climate they were forced to endure. Jack nodded at the havildar as the escort marched past. Major Dutton had been right to be proud of his men, and Jack found himself hoping that those of his own company would conduct themselves in the same professional and soldierly manner. "Slow down, my dear. This is no time for a race." Reverend young Summers admonished his daughter for her fast pace as he brought up the rear of the party, his exhausted horse lathered in sweat from carrying its hefty burden. "Come now, Papa. We're nearly there." Isabel fairly shone with delight, her joy at being away from the confines of cantonment life obvious. "Then we can rest and enjoy the picnic I have prepared." The idea of a rest and food had the desired effect, and young Summers spurred his horse hard so that he could catch up with his daughter. "Tell me, did you bring some of those devilled eggs that Mrs. Dutton has been promising me for the last month?" "I brought a dozen, Papa. Enough even for you." Isabel laughed as she teased her father, throwing her head back so that the soft pale blue scarf she had wrapped over her hair fell back. She laughed again, revelling in her freedom. Jack did his best not to stare as she released her glorious curls from the shackles of their clips and ties. The small party ground its way up the hill, entering a narrow defile. On either side the ground rose sharply, the dusty scree slope too steep for easy passage, and Jack felt a flicker of unease as he saw his small command compressed into the narrow space. He shook off the disquiet. It was too much of a relief to be stationary to spoil the moment with doubts, and he took a minute to enjoy simply sitting still. He had heard tales of picnic parties, of well-to-do people taking a dozen servants and moving the contents of a small house into the depths of the English countryside to enjoy a view or to sit by a river and read poetry. He had never imagined attending one himself, least of all on a dusty, scorching hillside thousands of miles from home. He waited patiently for the last of the 5 porters who laboured to carry the myriad items Isabel had deemed essential to the success of her simple expedition, before reluctantly urging his horse back into motion, grimacing as the movement jarred his aching back. A single shot rang out, the sharp retort echoing around the hillside. The bullet struck a rock no more than 2 yards away from the sepoy's right-hand file. A dozen more followed, the air filled with the bow-loosening snap of bullets whipping past. Any thoughts of a quiet picnic disappeared in a flash of musket fire. They were under attack. Isabel screamed. Jack slipped from the saddle, trying to make sense out of the confusion. There was another fusillade of bullets, sharp puffs of dust, flung high into the air as the deadly missiles struck the ground all around the terrified party. "Form skirmish line!" Jack's voice cracked as he shouted the first order, his mouth dry. He flinched as a bullet scored past his head, the first spasm of fear coursing through his veins. More shots rang out. Yet already they were becoming ragged, the sporadic rate of fire betraying a lack of discipline. Jack had no idea who was firing on them, but at least it was clear that the ambushers were not trained soldiers. Yet the desultory fire had stopped the party in its tracks, pinning them in place. The sound of a bullet striking flesh caught Jack's attention. It was a horrible sound, like a butcher slamming a carcass onto his chopping block, and one he had heard too many times in the Crimea not to recognise. He saw at once where the sound had come from. Isabel's horse was twisting on the spot as blood poured from a deep wound to its shoulder, blackening its mottled brown coat. Before she could free her feet from the stirrups, the maddened beast jerked hard to the left, flinging its rider off as the pain of the wound drove it wild. Isabel's slight frame was thrown to the ground, the jarring impact clearly audible from where Jack slipped and skidded towards her. More shots crashed down around him as he threw himself to his knees, instinctively screening her prone body where she lay face down in the dust. He reached out his hand, clasping the stunned girl around the shoulder. He could feel her muscles quiver under his touch, the softness of her flesh beneath his fingers sending a sudden, violent surge of lust through his body. He was shocked by the power of the unexpected rush of emotions, feelings he had believed scoured from his soul. Isabel looked up, her eyes glazed. She lifted her head from the ground, trying to push herself up. A thin trickle of blood flowed down her cheek, the bright trail of red a vivid contrast against the ghostly pallor of her face. "Stay down," Jack snarled the command through gritted teeth, angry at himself for sensing something in the contact with Isabel's young body that had no place when his small party was in danger. He felt her go limp as she submitted to his control. He waited, counting off the seconds, anticipating a lull in the firing. A number of shots rang out together, the haphazard volley giving him enough of an opportunity to move. He took a firm hold of Isabel's arm, tugging her to her feet before dragging her into cover behind a moss-covered boulder that was big enough to shelter her from the enemy's fire. "Damn you, Danbury!" Isabel's anger was obvious. As soon as Jack let go of her arm, her hands scrabbled at the buckles of the bag that hung around her neck. Her eyes flashed with triumph as she pulled out a compact revolver. "I can fight. You will stay here and do no such thing." "Don't you dare give me orders!" Isabel matched Jack's angry tone. "Now sort this mess out and don't concern yourself with protecting me. I have all the protection I need." She brandished the small revolver, and from the look in her eyes there was no doubt she would not be afraid to use it. "You will stay here and damn well do as I say, or I shall have one of the men keep you here at gunpoint," Jack snapped. "Is that clear, Miss Young Summers?" He saw the hurt on her face, the pout on her lips that was becoming so familiar. He turned his back on her, hoping he had cowed her into obeying him for the moment, burying the feelings that she had stirred inside him. There would be a time to wonder at the emotions she had awoken, but only if the two of them survived. The red-coated native soldiers had reacted quickly and efficiently. The havildar had followed Jack's orders, aligning the ranks calmly so that they formed an extended line facing the direction of the gunfire. The porters had gone to ground, hiding away, trusting to the escort to keep them safe. The small party was held up on the long slope that led to the village and the tower. The fire was coming from the raised ground on their right flank. Jack took in the situation quickly, his eyes never still as he assessed the threat, his mind already racing as he planned how to get his charges and his men out of danger. It was time to bring order out of the chaos. It was time to fight back. "Havildar, load!" Jack strode away from Isabel, bellowing orders, taking charge whilst doing his best to ignore the flickering bullets that stung the air around him. The ambush had come from above where the party had been labouring up the slope. Shooting downhill made aiming difficult, and to Jack's relief most of the shots were whispering past well over their heads. The cough that followed each shot told Jack that they were being fired on by muskets, and he offered a silent prayer of thanks that whoever was attacking did not have access to the powerful rifles the British soldiers had used to such deadly effect in the Crimea. If the enemy had hoped to flay the party with musket fire, then they were going to be disappointed. Jack turned around, assessing the situation, listening to the measured tones of the havildar as he took his men through the drill of loading their pieces. Just like Jack's men in the 24th, Dutton's soldiers were still using a percussion cap musket that had been in issue for over a decade and differed little from the weapon used at Waterloo 40 years previously. It did not have anything like the range or the power of the Minié rifle, and Jack knew he would have to make sure he did not overestimate the power of his men's volley. The sepoys finished loading, the extended ranks shuffling as the men flinched at the bullets snapping past their ears or stinging the ground around their feet. Jack nodded at the havildar. Front rank! Front rank, prepare to fire! Aim at the smoke! Jack called out the extra command before nodding again. Fire! The volley crashed out. The 5 muskets of the front rank firing in unison. They immediately began to reload as the second rank lifted their muskets to their shoulders. The crisp commands of the havildar marked their movements, the men carrying out their drill as they had been trained, the countless hours of practice paying dividends now they were under fire. The red-coated machine roared into life, fighting back with the calm professionalism of the trained soldier. Reverend Young Summers kicked hard as he urged his tired mount up the scree slope that led towards the tower. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath as laboured as if he had run up the slope himself. He had not known fear before that day. Nothing had prepared him for the churning pit of horror deep in his belly that screwed his guts into a knot of terror. He twisted in the saddle, searching for a glimpse of his daughter, his lips moving in a constant silent prayer, his bowels clenching and threatening to void as his fear bubbled inside him. He hesitated as he watched his daughter thrown from the saddle. His hands pulled on his horse's reins, momentarily slowing its headlong progress, his father's love making him pause. As he prepared to turn, he spotted the 24th's new captain scrabble his way towards his daughter's crumpled body. He saw Isabel move, her head lifting from the ground, the confirmation that she lived sending a surge of relief flooding through him. Another round of gunfire rang out, the flurry of shots sending bullets crashing around the ears of the small party. Young Summers felt his terror rebuilding, his stomach twisting as if the devil himself was inside, squirming in his guts, cruelly injecting the fear that consumed his soul. He abandoned his precious daughter to the care of a stranger and sought escape. "Get on, damn you! Get on!" He heard the fear in his own voice as he kicked his heels callously against his horse's sides, careless of his cruelty, desperate to get away from the bullets that had torn through the sunburnt air. He could not die. He could not carry out God's work as a corpse. The Reverend Young Summers ran from the danger, reassuring himself that he did God's will by saving his own skin. "Oh, dear Lord, save me!" He pushed himself up in the saddle, leaning his weight forward to urge the tiring horse on, his bowels exploding and farting the moment his backside lifted from the saddle. The scabby hillside suddenly fell away in front of him, revealing a patch of dead ground he had not seen as he charged up the slope. 100 yards of barren scrub still separated him from the edge of the village, all that remained between danger and safety. Yet it might as well have been 1,000. No. Oh, dear God, no! Young Summers had abandoned his only daughter in a desperate bid for safety, yet his coward's flight had not secured him the security he craved. Instead, Reverend Archibald Young Summers had found the tiger. Chapter 7. The second British volley crashed out, the sound rippling and echoing down the valley. "Rear rank! Reload! Front rank! Front rank! Prepare to fire!" The havildar strode behind the rear rank, his watchful glare roving over his charges as they reloaded. Jack flinched as a bullet scored past his head, reacting to the high-pitched sound as it punched through the air despite his best efforts to remain composed in front of his men. He knew the volume of fire was nothing compared to the barrage into which the British had marched with such stoic calm at the Alma. Yet, despite all he had experienced, his body still reacted with fear, his trembling hands all the evidence he needed to know that he had not become immune to the proximity of death. A red-coated sepoy took a glancing wound to his upper arm. The slight, dark-skinned soldier surprised Jack with a stream of foul invective straight from the dockside at Chatham as he staunched the flow of blood before retaking his place in the line. The sepoy's volley were having the effect Jack had intended. The enemy fire had slackened considerably, the ambushers driven into cover by the British response. Their return fire was sporadic, and Jack counted the puffs of smoke on the hillside, anxious to be able to get his small command away. He had just opened his mouth to order a final volley when a cheer erupted from in front of where the redcoats stood. It was a visceral snarl, the sound warriors made when released to fight, and was followed by the noise of dozens of armed men moving at once. The scrape of metal on metal as weapons were drawn and readied for use. Jack looked up the slope and cursed. He realised at once that the gunmen on the hillside had been given one role, to pin the party in place and divert their attention, whilst the main force of the ambush manoeuvred into position into the dead ground in front of the stalled column. It was a simple plan, but it was effective. "Fix bayonets." He did his best to sound calm. The 10 redcoats heard the order and reached for the scabbards in their belts that held the long steel bayonets. They were vicious weapons, deadly tools in the hands of a trained redcoat. For centuries, British soldiers had closed with their enemies, using the sharpened steel to win the famous victories of which they were so proud. The sepoys clicked the bayonets onto the locking points at the tip of their muskets, before wheeling in line so that their 2-man deep formation faced the crest of the slope. It was a pitiful defence, about as formidable as a child's sandcastle trying to hold back the tide. Yet the redcoats stood their ground, pointing their wicked bayonets forward, ready for the enemy to appear. "Aim low when they come. Hit the bastards in the belly." Jack offered the advice through gritted teeth. "Aim low." He reached down and tugged his regulation sabre from its scabbard. It felt horribly light in his hand. It was a cheap blade, the Calcutta dealer's assurance that it was made from true English steel now looking as paper-thin as the sword itself. With his other hand he drew his Adams revolver, the sturdy weapon primed and loaded. At least he had one weapon he knew he could rely on. "Prepare to charge." 10 dark faces turned to face him at once, the same look of horror and shock in each set of eyes. Only the havildar kept his expression neutral. He held Jack's gaze for a long moment, his eyes betraying nothing. "Prepare to charge!" The native sergeant echoed Jack's order before taking his place behind the thin red line. Jack glanced quickly over his shoulder to check that Isabel had stayed where he had left her. There was no time for her to do anything but trust her escort. The only hope for them all lay in fighting hard and driving off the ambush. Jack could not wait for the enemy to arrive. He would gamble everything on a single volley followed by a madcap charge. 10 native soldiers, 1 havildar and 1 impostor would risk a wild assault against the enemy. 11 bayonets and a suspect sword against a horde. The slope stretched away in front of them, the distant tower standing proud against the palest blue sky. A single thin smear of cloud crept leisurely across the view like a steam-powered barge on a gentle afternoon's cruise. The enemy's musket fire had died away, so that only the noise of armed men on the move marred the tranquillity. The redcoats stood, silent and steady, waiting for the enemy to appear. The men gripped their muskets tightly, holding them at the ready, the white of their knuckles evidence of the tension that surged through them. The first figure appeared, silhouetted against the skyline. The single bandit stood alone, his sword lifted high as he contemplated the thin line that barred his path. Then the rest of the mob appeared, surging past the lone figure, their blades raised as they charged the red-coated soldiers who had dared to enter their domain. There were many more than Jack had imagined. Some were naked save for a langotti around the groin. Their skin glistened with a thick layer of grease, their hands holding anything that could be used to cudgel or hack a man to death. Others were dressed like knights of old, the fierce sunlight reflecting from their polished armour, their gleaming sabres bared and ready to kill. There were flashes of red in the throng, the vivid scarlet of a deserter's coat bright in the packed ranks. But mainly Jack just saw disaster. His small command no match for the multitude that thundered towards them. The enemy leader appeared. He was a giant of a man, mounted on an enormous warhorse, and he loomed over his men like a vengeful god. He was dressed as finely as a prince, with thick, swirling black robes, his bearing as regal as that of an English duke. His thickly bearded face was creased in a ferocious scowl, his mouth stretched wide as he urged his men up and over the crest, calling for them to kill, to slay those who had strayed near to his lair. "Prepare to fire!" 10 bayonet-tipped muskets were brought to the shoulder at the curt command, the redcoats taking up the slack in the trigger as they readied for the order to fire. Jack held back the final command. He saw the muzzles waver as the men struggled to hold the unwieldy weapons steady, the 17 inches of steel making them unbalanced and clumsy. There would be time for a single volley, one chance for the muskets to spit out death before the men would be unleashed and ordered to charge. Jack could not afford to waste it, and he forced himself to stand calm, waiting until the enemy was close enough so that every shot would find a target. The disordered mob surged forward. Still Jack delayed the order to fire, even though the ambushers were so close that he could see every detail on the faces rushing towards him. The mob was no more than 50 yards away, just a moment from reaching the thin red line that stood with such stoic defiance in their path. "Fire!" Jack bellowed the order, releasing the tension that had gripped him since the first bandit had appeared. The sepoys obeyed immediately, the sudden thunderclap of sound shocking in its violence as the muskets fired as one. He had deliberately left the volley late, the front of the mob barely 25 yards from the frail British line. At such close range, every bullet smacked into an enemy body, flinching those who had rushed to the fore. "Charge! Charge!" Jack felt his fear released. Nothing mattered now, nothing except the need to fight, to take his sword and hack at the enemy. This was the intoxicating madness that he had half forgotten, the soul-searing surge of hate and anger that combined with his fear to drive him willingly into the dreadful cauldron of battle. He tore out of the cloud of smoke created by the discharging muskets. The ambush had been bludgeoned to a halt. Bloodied, crumpled bodies formed a grotesque barrier and tangled around the feet of those nearest to them, the impetus of the bandits' charge broken by the brutal volley. He heard a roar behind him as the sepoys followed his lead, their sudden scream a horrific contrast to the stoic silence with which they had watched the enemy close on them. The men in red coats were unleashed to do what they had been trained to do. It was time to kill. Jack rushed at the stalled mob, the last few yards disappearing in a blur of movement as he led his men forwards. He ducked under a farmer's sickle, wielded by a man dressed in nothing more than a simple loincloth. The curving blade flashed past, missing his neck by no more than an inch. He was on the man in a heartbeat, the narrow escape meaning nothing as the madness of battle surged through him. There was time to see terror ripple through the man's greased body before Jack rammed his sword into his throat. As he tore his blade from the gruesome wound, his victim fell to the ground, his hands clasped around the dreadful ruin of his neck. Jack was forced to step swiftly to his left to avoid a spear thrust aimed at his side, the speed of the melee leaving no time for thought. He back-swung his sword, using the sharpened rear edge to gouge across the face of the white-robed man who had just attempted to kill him. Another spear thrust from the mass that swirled around him tore through his red coat, missing his flesh by inches. Jack spun as he felt the impact, slashing upwards, releasing a howl of frustration as it bounced off the heavy robes of his assailant, the thin edge of the cheap sword already too dull to cut through the thickly bound cloth. But the blow drove the attacker back, giving Jack enough time to raise his revolver. The barrel of the weapon was no more than 6 inches from the nearest attacker in the press of bodies. He pulled the trigger, aiming at the snarling face of a heavily armoured man who was lifting a thick talwar above his head, readying himself for a blow that would shatter Jack's skull with a single strike. The bullet punched into the man's face, blood and scraps of flesh flung wide as it smashed through skin and bone. The man fell, and Jack felt nothing, already searching for his next target, his soul emptied of all emotion save the need to kill. He aimed into the whirl of bodies, pulling the trigger again and again, each shot knocking another one of the enemy from their feet, the pistol deadly in the bloody close-quarters fight. His fusillade drove the ambushers away from him as he cut a dreadful swathe of death through their ranks. It gave his sepoys an opening, and they threw themselves into the gap he had created, their bayonets reaching for the enemy, their shrill, banshee cries the last sound many of the ambushers would ever hear. They thrust into the mass of bodies, wielding their bayonets in the short, professional jabs they had learnt on the drill square. The ground under their feet was littered with the dead and the dying, the hideous stench of blood and opened bowels filling their nostrils as they surged forwards, seeking the next victim for their blades. It would have taken a brave man or a fool to stand in their way, and the disparate horde recoiled from the disciplined charge. Jack let his men push past him. His blood thundered with the need to throw himself back into the melee, but he forced himself to still the urge, his need for knowledge overriding the visceral instinct to fight. The sepoy's thrust into the enemy's ranks gave him a few precious seconds to try to make sense of the desperate struggle. Seconds he could not afford to waste if he was to defy the gods and snatch a bloody victory from the gaping jaws of defeat. The ambushers were giving ground, melting away from the horror of the sepoys' volley and their merciless bayonets. Yet, despite their bravery and brutal efficiency, the red-coated soldiers were still outnumbered. The mob might have been giving ground in front of the assault, but more and more were moving to the flanks, swarming around the handful of British soldiers. When they rediscovered their courage, Jack's command would be overwhelmed. Chapter 8. Isabel crouched behind the boulder, transfixed by the gory spectacle going on no more than 24 yards from where she hid. For as long as she could remember, she had read about battle, captivated by the dry, urbane accounts of campaigns and set-piece war written by generals and commanders. She had devoured every book she could find, from Livy to Wellington. Yet she had never before contemplated the brutality that she saw unfurling before her. The dusty, emotionless words did nothing to convey the dreadful struggle in which men hacked and gouged in a desperate fight to kill or be killed. There was no glory in war, and the sordid, squalid sight she was witnessing left her struggling to control the waves of nausea that lurched through her body. The black-robed leader of the enemy horde detached himself from the fighting. Even across the yards of scrub she felt his eyes bore into her. Her throat constricted in fear as he eased his charger round, turning its head to face where she hid, before kicking the mount into motion, riding straight for her. He never once let his eyes leave her, staring into her terrified gaze as he rode down the slope. "Danbury!" The scream tore from her throat as the heavily armoured figure slid from his horse a few yards in front of her. The man was huge, a figure from a nightmare, his robes the colour of night, his black eyes pitiless. He was a vision of hell manifest on earth. Agile despite his bulk, the huge warrior landed gently on his feet. Isabel saw the purpose in his action. Fear surged through her, a visceral wave of animal terror more powerful than anything she had ever known. It burst out of her like a river in flood, breaching its banks. "Danbury! Danbury!" She shrieked his name in panic, her voice shrill. The black-robed figure was unmoved, no trace of emotion visible behind the beard that smothered his face. He lifted a single gauntleted hand, holding it towards her as if inviting her to dance. Her fear reasserting itself, she stood mute, powerless to resist. "Come." The man's voice was soft, barely above a whisper, and Isabel struggled to hear the single command over the cacophony of the fight that carried on regardless of her plight. The fingers encased in thick black leather gloves flexed, beckoning her to him. She felt her body jerk into motion as if tugged forwards by an invisible chain. She thought nothing of the silver revolver she still held in her left hand, the idea of resisting never once entering her mind. Her movements felt ponderous, as if the ground was cloying mud rather than dusty soil, her eyes fixed on the face that observed her progress with serenity, and she reached out her free hand, demurely offering it as if she were shyly accepting a suitor's request for a dance at a dowager's ball. She laid her small hand in the centre of the leather gauntlet and surrendered. The ambushers swarmed forwards, surrounding the small group of sepoys, forcing Jack back into the fight. He flicked his sword out, deflecting a richly jewelled tulwar that reached for his eyes, then brought his own blade around in a glittering arc to parry an ancient bayonet-tipped musket that was thrust at his stomach. More blades reached forward, the enemy's courage growing with every second as the wild horde sensed the weakness in the tiring sepoys. The first of Jack's men went down, a pig-sticking spear finding its way past his jabbing bayonet. The leaf-shaped head slid through the thick scarlet coat and into the sepoy's flesh, the fiendish shriek of triumph emitted by its owner, the last sound the dying soldier would ever hear. The sight of the first red-coated devil falling to the ground galvanized the rest of the mob. Those too cunning or too fearful to have been at the forefront of the attack sensed the change, belatedly pushing forward, their desire to fight kindled now that victory seemed certain. As one, the mob closed on the small band of soldiers that had fought with such courage. Like a pack of wild dogs, they flung themselves into the fight, each keen to wet their blades in the sepoy's blood, eager for the gory proof of their valour. The surviving members of the escort did not stand a chance. The enemy swarmed around them, countless blades whirling, attacks coming from all sides. Yet still the sepoys fought on, stamping their feet forwards, thrusting their bayonets at the bodies that pressed against them, their leaden arms and aching muscles forced to continue the fight. the soldiers of the foreign queen refusing to submit meekly to their fate. Above the cacophony of the fight, Jack heard Isabel scream his assumed name. He shoved a naked fanatic backwards with his shoulder, using the point of his sword to tear a fist-sized hole in the man's grease-covered stomach, then forced his way out of the vicious melee, his blunted sword bludgeoning those of the ambushers seeking to attack the rear of the sepoy's fragile formation. He had no concept of how long they had fought, the passage of time meaningless in the grotesque struggle where a single heartbeat could pass between life and death. All he knew was that Isabel's terrified scream was a call for help he had to heed. Free of the fight, Jack ran hard, ignoring the spasm of pain in the pit of his spine and the dreadful ache in his sword arm, focusing his attention on the tall figure that loomed over Isabel's tiny frame. At any second he expected the man to turn, to react to the single foolish redcoat charging towards him. But the black-robed giant stayed facing Isabel, his back left undefended and exposed. It gave Jack an opportunity, and he strained every tired sinew as he strove to reach Isabel and somehow drag her to safety. The ground passed slowly under his boots, the uneven surface twisting each footfall. He was certain his legs would give way at any moment, buckling under the strain of racing down the slope to send him tumbling and falling to the floor. Yet somehow he kept his footing, and he counted off the seconds as he hurtled towards the black-robed figure. Yard by yard, step by step, he closed the gap between them, no longer hearing the attacker's shouts of victory or the thunder of his own heartbeat in his ears. He screamed as he charged, the final few yards disappearing in a sudden rush as he flung himself at the huge man, releasing his tension into a blow aimed at the back of the bandit's neck. It was a vicious attack, driven by all of Jack's anger at the futility of the desperate fight. His sword vibrated in his hand as it sliced through the air, the aching muscles in his forearm already bracing for the moment of impact, for the shock of the blade ripping into the enemy leader's flesh. The talwar came out of nowhere. The black-robed figure spun round, his richly decorated blade whispering upwards with the speed of a striking cobra, the huge two-handed sword blocking the blow that had been a heartbeat away from ending his life. The counterattack smashed Jack's sword to one side, violently deflecting his blade away. Jack was immediately thrown completely off balance, and he tumbled to the floor, hitting the stony ground with a bone-jarring thump. As he fell, the talwar flickered through the air, missing his head by a fraction of an inch. Jack threw himself to one side as soon as he hit the ground, using the momentum of his fall to roll away from the enemy, ignoring the stabs of agony as his body scraped across the rocky soil. Once, twice, the talwar stabbed downwards, missing him by no more than a hair's breadth, the attacks coming at him so fast that he could do nothing but throw himself down the slope and hope that he could avoid the deadly blade. His wild tumble gained momentum, the incline of the slope adding speed to his movement. He sensed another attack, the flash of the talwar slicing through the air inches from his nose. The blade went wide. It gave Jack the slightest of openings, and he pushed with his feet, scrabbling for purchase. He scrabbled to his feet with as much speed as he could muster, and with a dull clang his notched and pitted sword met the dreadful talwar. His desperate parry battered the sword to one side, saving him moments before his enemy's sword would have been thrust into his guts. The fierce surge of elation at once again being able to fight was short-lived. The black-robed figure stepped forwards, unleashing a flurry of attacks that had Jack sliding backwards as he struggled to counter the pace of his enemy's movements. The talwar sliced through the air, each slash followed within a heartbeat by another, a relentless salvo that drove him back down the slope, his sword arm ringing as he blocked each blow as best he could. "For pity's sake, shoot him!" he screamed at Isabel. She gave no sign of having heard him. The small silver revolver was still clutched in her left hand, but it hung uselessly by her side, the terrified girl giving no thought to the weapon that she had brandished with such defiance only a short time before. Jack twisted to one side, his attempt to get Isabel's attention momentarily distracting him and nearly letting the black-robed swordsman's blade slip past his faltering defence. Again and again he parried the fast-moving talwar. He was forced to forget Isabel as he fought for his life. Every ounce of his strength needed to counter the terrifying rain of blows that came at him one after another, each driven by a strength he could barely match. The black-robed figure started to chant as he fought. Underscored by the metallic clash of swords, the deep voice rumbled in a hypnotic rhythm. Jack did his best to pay no heed to the words, but they unsettled him nonetheless, the menace in the foreign phrases clear. With a loud cry, the chant stopped. The black-robed figure paused for no more than a single heartbeat before his sword whirled through the air, slashing towards Jack in a blow of immense power. Jack thrust his battered sabre forward. His speed saved him, the two blades coming together a fraction of a second before the talwar would have crashed into his unprotected head. Yet the noise of the impact was wrong. With a dull thud, Jack's sabre shattered, the cheap steel cleaved in half by the power of the bandit leader's attack. He could only stare in horror as the top half of his weapon spun away, leaving only the shattered stump in his hand. Jack's stubborn defence was ended, leaving him unarmed and defenceless. He felt the shadow of death loom over him as the black-robed figure pulled back his sword arm, preparing the thrust that Jack could no longer counter. He looked into his enemy's face and knew he was about to die. Chapter 9. Isabel had watched as if paralysed as the black-robed figure flayed mercilessly at the British officer. At any moment she expected the fast-moving talwar to break through Danbury's desperate defence, his faltering defiance certain to be no match for the power of his assailant's wild assault. Somehow, though, Danbury stayed alive, his sabre meeting every blow. Isabel had never seen such ferocity. The two men fought at a frightening pace, their blades moving with such speed that she could barely even see the dreadful steel as it flashed through the air. She did not hear Danbury call to her. It was only when the dark-robed figure started to chant that she felt herself return to her senses. She felt Danbury begin to waver, the sinister incantation unsettling the British captain. "Danbury!" She screamed his name as the chant came to its terrifying conclusion, but her voice was lost in the black-robed figure's cry, and she could only watch in horror as his sword slashed towards Danbury with a speed and power that seemed impossible to counter. The sound of the British officer's sword snapping reached her in the moments after the dreadful chant came to an end. She saw the appalled look on Danbury's face as he realised he was about to die. She ran forwards, careless of the enemy horde that had begun to swarm down the slope. Her only thought was to help, to try to save the red-coated officer before he was struck down in front of her eyes. "Danbury! Catch!" She drew back her arm, tossing the beleaguered captain a lifeline, praying that she had acted in time to save him. The silver metal of the revolver flashed once in the sun as Isabel's throw sent it spinning through the air. Jack flung the stump of his broken sword towards the black-robed figure, freeing his hands of the now useless weapon. He snatched at the tiny revolver, snapping it from the air, the sharp metal stinging his hand. Without pause he brought his arm around, pointing the gun straight at the face of the man about to kill him. His thumb slid over the back of the finely crafted weapon, cocking the hammer, readying it to fire. The heavily bearded face loomed over the simple sight at the end of the revolver's barrel. At such close range Jack knew he could not miss, and he felt a surge of savage joy as he pulled the trigger. Instead of the crash of gunpowder igniting, there was nothing but an impotent click. Isabel's precious revolver had failed to fire. The black-robed figure sheathed his sword. He took a pace backwards before disdainfully turning away from the man who had come so close to killing him. Jack dropped the useless pistol, letting it fall from his hand as he felt defeat swamp him. He stood mute, watching the savage mob race down the slope towards him. The bandits circled around, their blades threatening, but none was willing to be the first to strike. Their leader flicked a gauntleted hand in Jack's direction, a curt word of command putting an end to the impasse. A swarthy figure took a pace forward, hefting a heavy club. Without a word, he slammed it into the back of Jack's head, bludgeoning him to the ground. The darkness swallowed his soul. Jack felt its cold embrace, its touch as delicate and as jealous as a lover's. He did not fight it, as once he had. Instead, he welcomed it, submitting to it with the grace of a maiden bride on her marriage bed. There was no fear in giving in, just relief. He faced the blackness and willed it to take him. But the darkness rejected him, thrusting him away, throwing him towards the distant light. Jack screamed inwardly with frustration as he felt the icy tendrils release him, forcing him to return to the place that terrified him most. Jack opened his eyes. At first it was hard to tell if they were truly open or not. He could feel a hard stone floor under his body, its dampness soaking into his clothes. He could smell mould and decay, the stench of unwashed bodies and animal waste thick in his nostrils. He tasted the staleness of the air, the cold, dead flavour of the dark. "Danbury?" The voice startled him. His name was spoken in no more than a whisper, but there was no mistaking its owner. Isabel Youngsummers had sensed him stirring and called to him, summoning him back to the world he had so dearly wished to leave. "Danbury, are you awake?" Jack's cramped and aching muscles protested as he started to move. He forced himself to sit, finally coming truly alive, belatedly starting to take stock of his surroundings. There was little for his eyes to focus on. The room had been hacked into rock, the walls still bearing the marks of the simple tools that had been used to gouge and scrape the space from the hard ground. A single door was shut tight, the small window in its centre barred with thick metal columns, each crusted with rust. The window was the only source of light, a single torch that burned just outside the door, casting forbidding shadows into the depths of the fetid space. "Danbury, thank God!" Isabel's relief was clear. "We thought you might be dead." "We may soon wish that were the case." Jack heard the second voice and turned his head, his neck complaining as it jarred with the movement. The Reverend young Summers sat slumped against the wall to his right. "It's good to see you, Danbury, but I fear you may have preferred it were you not to have woken." Young Summers sobbed as he finished speaking, an anguished wail escaping his thick lips. "We are doomed." "Papa!" Isabel's hands lifted to her face, hiding the sight of her father's distress. "Dear God, why are you doing this to me?" Young Summers pushed himself forwards and onto his knees. He raised his arms to the ceiling as he beseeched his God, lamenting his bitter fate. "Why submit me to this torture? Why have you forsaken your loyal servant? Why?" He fell silent, his head bowed so that his thick chin rested on his chest, his corpulent frame rocking with the motion of his sobs. "What happened?" Jack spoke for the first time, his voice thick with phlegm. He spat hard, careless of the look of disgust on the Reverend's tear-streaked face. Young Summers slumped back into his former position, exhausted by his pitiful plea. "They've kept us alive because of the colour of our skin." The clergyman spoke in the exhausted voice of a dying man. "So that they can torture us." "Don't be such a fool, Papa," Isabel snapped. Her eyes flashed with the same look of defiance Jack had seen when they were first ambushed. "They've kept us alive because they believe we have value. They will think to ransom us. We cannot lose hope." "Hope!" Young Summers wailed the word. "Do you not see, daughter? God has forsaken me. He has given me up to the godless. He has abandoned me." "Papa, do not speak like that. We are alive." "Isabel's right," Jack spoke, silencing father and daughter. They both turned to face him, looking to him for guidance. "They've kept us alive because we have value to them. What happened to the men?" "Dead. All dead. They butchered them." Young Summers relished the words, finding strength in the sufferings of others. "They died fighting," Isabel corrected her father. "They fought hard. As did you, Danbury." Jack took no pleasure in hearing Isabel's praise. "We lost. We should have fought harder." "That is a foolish thing to say. Against so many there was nothing more you could do." Jack's brow furrowed as he looked at Isabel. I'm not so sure." "So, what will happen to us?" asked Isabel, her voice timid. She sounded very much like the frightened little girl she really was. "They will kill us," young Summers interrupted. "Those blackguards have no qualms. They're godless scum, and they will slaughter us without a thought." "That's enough." Jack injected some snap into his tone. It was the voice of an officer, one that was used to being obeyed. Young Summers opened his mouth to object before a look at the hard eyes of the British captain silenced him. "We are alive," Jack continued. "If they wanted us dead, they would have killed us on the spot. I doubt these fellows know much of patience. Isabel is right. They will try to ransom us." Isabel nodded as she listened intently to his words. Her father was not so calm. "You know nothing of these people, least of all what they will do to us." Young Summers looked at his daughter, licking his lips nervously before leaning closer to Jack. "I fear for my daughter's chastity." The words were said in a whisper, a furtive look on the Reverend's face. "They will have to kill me first." Young Summers snorted his derision at Jack's bold claim. "I'm sure they would not find that so difficult, Danbury. How can you speak of fighting?" Jack grinned. "Because I'm a redcoat. It's what we do." "Spoken like a fool." Young Summers' jowls creased in irritation. "Be careful who you call a fool, Reverend." Young Summers raised a trembling finger and pointed it towards Jack's heart. "You, sir, you are a fool if you think your precious pride matters one bit. I call you a fool for you speak foolish words." Jack felt a spark of temper, but he bit his tongue. He had learned to curb his emotions when confronted by bombastic buffoons. The Reverend Young Summers knew no such forbearance. "You are the reason we are here. It is you who is to blame for our incarceration at the hands of these godless barbarians." His fear added fuel to his tongue. "You were ordered to protect us, and you failed, Danbury. You failed. I face a martyr's death because you could not obey that simple instruction. It is your fault. Yours.
You're a disgrace!"
Young Summers fell silent, his rage spent. His pudgy hands smothered his face as the tears came, his body rocking back and forth, his distress overwhelming him. Isabel had sat in shocked silence as her father broke down. Her whey-coloured face revealed her anguish, her self-control eroding when she heard the horror in her father's voice, his certainty that they faced death taking a grip on her heart. Jack smiled as he looked at her, yet she simply stared back at him, her eyes wide with terror. "Your father's right. I am a disgrace." He spoke in the even tones of a father reading a nighttime story to calm his child's fear of the darkness, his words intended to calm and soothe. "But I meant what I said. I shall die trying to protect you. I promise." He offered the promise willingly, and he meant every word. He did not fear death. It was life that terrified him. Chapter 10.
"For the love of heaven! It has begun! They are coming for me!"
Reverend young Summers greeted the sudden burst of noise with horror. "Be quiet!" Jack snapped the command as his ears strained to hear. It had been a long night, the silence that had lapsed over the prisoners wearing at Jack's patience. He guessed that it was not yet dawn, but trapped in the gloomy prison he had no real notion of the passage of time. Now something had awoken to shatter the quiet, and Jack was in no mood to be gentle on the pessimistic doomsayer. He moved quickly so he could peer out of the door's single window. His order had silenced young Summers, who fell back into morose silence, slumping against the wall in resignation. "What is it?" Isabel had risen lithely to her feet, and now she pressed against Jack's shoulder as she tried to see movement outside their dank prison. The noise came again. It sounded like a child running a stick down a line of metal railings. It came in bursts, each louder than the previous, before dying out, the silence pressing back so that they felt that they had surely been mistaken, that nothing stirred to disturb the black nothingness of the night. Then the shouting started, the frightened bellows of men waking to chaos, and the silence disappeared under a bewildering hubbub of sound as the rabble that had defeated the small band of British sepoys arose to confusion. The crackle of gunfire underscored the panic, its staccato rhythm increasing in tempo to match the bedlam it had created. Jack could feel Isabel's breath on the nape of his neck, the warmth at once soothing and stimulating. He could sense her body trembling, her breathing quicker as she too heard the sudden bursts of gunfire, her fear and her hope rising in equal measure. "What is it?" She raised her hand, placing it on Jack's shoulder as she sought reassurance. "Is it a rescue?" Jack's breath caught in his throat as he felt Isabel's fingers press into the muscles of his shoulder. "It's gunfire, but it's not ours." Her hand felt as if it was on fire, her flesh burning into his skin even through the thick layers of his uniform. "How can you tell?" "There are no regular volleys, and the firing is too erratic even for skirmishers." Jack turned his head so he could look at Isabel. He could smell the faded perfume she had applied the previous morning, the sweet aroma still intoxicating. "I don't know who it is." A sudden scrabble of footsteps saved Jack from further questioning. There were enough blazing torches rammed into ancient wall brackets to allow him to make out what was happening in the corridor outside. It bent to the right, so he could see no more than a few feet, but the noise was unmistakable. Someone was rushing towards the damp cell that had become their prison. He was certain that the sudden gunfire meant that the bandits' camp was under attack. He was equally sure that someone would remember the hostages even in the midst of the sudden melee. It would take but a quick word of command to dispatch a few men to quickly dispose of the 3 English prisoners, and he felt his heart lurch as he realised the danger that was surely hurtling towards them. He pushed Isabel to one side, thinking to shield her from the assault, taking up a position to block any intruder's entrance to the room. The footsteps sounded loud in the corridor. More than one man was heading their way. Jack caught a glimpse of shadowy figures rushing down the corridor before the door was thumped hard. The sharp scrape of metal was loud in the small room, a rusty iron lock grating as it was wrenched open. He was tensing himself to fight when a desperate notion came to him. He spun on the spot, pushing Isabel in front of him and throwing himself towards the murkiest corner of the room, into what he hoped were the darkest of the shadows. Young Summers lurched to his feet as he saw his daughter propelled towards mortal danger.
"You blackguard!"
The protest burst out as the door was thrown open to crash back on its hinges. Isabel screamed at the sight of 2 armed men, their drawn swords flickering in the dull light that had belatedly reached the darkened room. Young Summers blundered forward, reaching for his daughter's arm, the rush of courage pitching him directly into the path of the men sent to kill them. The first man's eyes darted around the room, searching for danger. He saw the thin girl who shrieked as if the devil himself were arriving to claim her soul. He saw too the fat man who staggered into his path, his foreign words echoing loudly in the confined space. He did not see the 3rd prisoner, the white-faced officer who had fought with such ferocity that afternoon. The 2nd man held back, reluctant to enter the darkened room, using his companion's body as a shield. Jack launched himself from the darkness, screaming like a banshee as he lashed out at the leading bandit. He smashed his fist into the centre of the man's face before driving his left hand into the side of his head, cracking his fist against the hard skull. His victim crumpled, bludgeoned by the unexpected assault, his sword clattering to the ground as it fell from his nerveless grip. Jack bent and snatched up the fallen weapon, whipping the blade through the air, turning to face the 2nd man. Isabel screamed at the sudden, shocking violence. Jack ignored her terror and slashed his stolen sword forwards, forcing the 2nd would-be killer to parry. He struck again, punching an opening in his opponent's defence, a visceral shout of anger escaping his lips. As he prepared to thrust his blade home, young Summers rushed past, bellowing in fear and knocking against Jack's arm, spoiling the killing stroke. The clumsy clergyman stumbled away, heedless of his actions, thinking of nothing more than reaching the darkest corner of the room. The bandit seized on the sudden reprieve and counter-attacked, coming at Jack with a quick series of blows that drove him backwards. In the darkness it was hard to see the fast-moving blade, and Jack was reduced to a desperate defence as he tried to keep the enemy's sword at bay.
"Lord, save me!"
Young Summers shrieked as the pair came close to his sanctuary. In his terror he lashed out with his feet, catching the bandit on the calf. The blow was no more powerful than a child's, but it made the would-be killer stumble. Jack saw the talwar drop and launched himself forward. His sword took the bandit in the throat. The blade drove deep, tearing away the man's life in a rush of blood, killing him in a heartbeat.
"Danbury, look out!"
Isabel screamed the warning, as the first attacker stumbled to his feet, snatching a thin dagger from within the folds of his black robes. Jack threw himself around to face the new threat, ripping his sword free so that blood and scraps of flesh were torn from the wound and flung far into the room. The surviving bandit was slow. Jack's ferocious assault had left him dazed and hurting, yet he saw the attack coming and lurched backward so that Jack's blade whirled past, the tip of the sword whispering no more than a hair's breadth from his bloodied face. With an incoherent shriek, he bounded forwards, his wrist locked so that he could drive his dagger deep into his enemy. Jack saw the razor-sharp blade reaching for him. In desperation, he flung his left hand forwards, locking it tight onto the other man's wrist. He could feel the muscles pulsing under his grasping fingers, the sinews in the flesh twisting as his opponent tried to free himself. The bandit slammed his free hand forward, smacking Jack hard on the side of the head, trying to knock him backwards. Jack's head rang from the blow, but somehow he held on, his fingers digging into the other man's wrist. His sword arm was trapped between their two bodies, so he let his blade go and pulled his right hand free, bracing himself to strike back. He saw the man's lip curl in a snarl of animal anger, his teeth stained red with his own blood. The bandit spat at Jack and used both hands to try to wrestle the dagger away from the man he had been sent to kill, cursing the Ferengi officer who refused to die. Jack felt the strength in the man's arms as they fought for control of the blade. He knew he had only moments before he lost his hold on the dagger. But his right hand was now free, and he thrust it forwards and grabbed his attacker by the balls. The man screamed in agony as Jack took hold, twisting his hand, his fingers digging in like claws, the flesh tearing under his grip. The bandit let out an inhuman shriek and let go of the dagger, both his hands scrabbling to free himself from the agony. Jack snatched the dagger from the air. He had a moment to register the look of horror in his enemy's eyes before he buried the sharpened blade deep into the man's heart. The bandit looked down in astonishment to see his own knife sticking out of his chest, blood coursing down its length. His fingers clutched at the weapon, his face set in a look of astonishment and bitter reproach. Jack twisted his wrist and tugged the dagger from the bandit's chest, ignoring the blood that poured down the blade to fall hot and sticky onto his hands. He stepped back and let the corpse fall to the floor, the look of terrified anguish now locked on the man's features forever. Then he threw the bloody dagger to one side and bent to retrieve the fallen sabre. "Isabel, it's time to go." He spoke firmly. He saw the fear in her eyes, but there was no time to dwell on whether she was afraid of the closeness of death or of the man who had fought to save her. "I'm ready." To her credit, Isabel rallied fast. "Papa, come." Young Summers did not move. He sat slumped against the wall, his face covered with scraps of flesh and flecks of blood that had been flung from the tip of Jack's sword as he fought. His eyes were open, but they were glazed and staring straight ahead. "Papa, we're safe now. We need to go." Isabel reached forwards and gently stroked her father's cheek. Young Summers lifted a hand in front of his face, flapping Isabel's away.
"The devil has come for me. I am in hell."
"Papa!" Isabel snapped the word and reached for her father again, only for her hand to be pushed away once more.
"Do you not see?"
Young Summers locked his staring eyes onto his daughter.
"The devil wants me. He wants me."
Isabel stamped her foot and turned to Jack. "He won't come. You'll have to carry him." Jack paid her no heed. He had checked the bodies of both bandits to make sure they were truly dead before moving out of their tiny prison to peer anxiously around the corner of the corridor that led towards the outside. "Captain Danbury," Isabel demanded his attention, "you will have to carry my father to safety." Jack took one last look around the corner before turning to face Isabel. She stood, hands on hips, in the centre of the room, the bodies of the two dead men forgotten as she issued her orders. Jack could only marvel at her spirit. She had been moments from death, yet now her anger rose like that of a spoiled child as she sought to get her own way. "We must go." He kept his voice calm, despite knowing they had to hurry before killers were sent after them. "He can stay here. He'll be safe enough for now." "Leave him here? Never!" Isabel's eyes widened in anger. "In that case, get him up, and he can come with us." He won't move. He's having an attack of the vapours. Then he stays here. He will not. You must carry him. Jack felt his mouth crease into a grin at the absurd notion. He detected the fury on Isabel's face as she saw his reaction, so he smiled wider. I don't think so. Perhaps it would be better for you both to stay here. I'll come back for you when it's safe to do so. You shall do no such thing. Isabel's voice rose in anger. She stepped forward, decorously skirting the lifeless hand of one of the men sent to kill her so she could wag her finger in Jack's face. You will do as I tell you. Jack caught her hand, holding the finger tight in his bloody grasp, and bent his head low so that it was only an inch or so from Isabel's face. The temptation to kiss her was almost overpowering. Can you really see me carrying him? Who's being a fool now? His desire made him harsh, and he saw his hard words crush the anger from the young girl's face just as he crushed her finger in his hand. Isabel pulled away and he let her go, turning his back on her lest she see the lust that he was sure was written into every pore of his face. Very well. He will stay here, but I am coming with you. She spoke the words in the icy tones of a dowager giving instructions to her butler. Jack turned and bowed at the waist. Yes, milady. He did not wait to see how Isabel would react. Instead, he walked out of the room. It was time to see what stirred in the darkness. Chapter 11. The sounds of battle echoed down the narrow passageway. Jack kept his sword to the fore, muttering a silent prayer as he crept forward. The wall on his right blocked the free movement of his sword arm, so he was forced to walk with his arm bent awkwardly as he tried to keep his stolen blade at the ready. The sounds of fighting grew louder with every step. Jack slowed his pace as the floor levelled out, certain he had to be close to reaching the end of the passage. He pushed himself hard against the left side of the tunnel, giving his sword arm as much room as he could, and inched his way forward. He turned quickly, gesturing for Isabel to stay back, fearful of striking her should he be forced to fight. She shrank back, instantly, any notion of disobedience driven away by the tension of tiptoeing along the dark corridor. The loud crash of a musket being fired assaulted his eardrums, the thunderclap of sound amplified by the thick walls. A thin cloud of pungent smoke billowed towards him, the familiar smell of rotten eggs sticking in his throat. He paused for a moment, tensing his muscles, before throwing himself round the corner, trusting to his speed to overcome any danger waiting after the final bend. A turbaned figure knelt behind a makeshift barricade that blocked the exit from the passageway. The bandit had just pulled an aged brown Bess musket back over the barricade, a thin trail of smoke snaking from its bayonet-tipped barrel. He looked behind him in astonishment, his jaws hanging in amazement as a red-coated British officer appeared from the depths of the tunnel. Jack gave the shocked musketeer no time to recover. He smashed his sword's hilt onto the top of the man's head, bludgeoning him to the ground with a single blow. Then he dragged the fallen man out of the way and crouched down behind the rough barricade, trying to make sense of the confusion that swirled in the darkness beyond the passageway. A scene of chaos greeted his eyes. It was still night, but the scene was lit by 6 watchfires, the flickering light casting disorientating shadows amongst the shapes of fast-moving bodies. Men ran in every direction, some brandishing weapons, others with arms full of plunder. Crumpled bodies lay scattered across the ground, proof of the effectiveness of the gunfire the prisoners had heard. As Jack watched, he saw a mounted figure ride past no more than 10 yards from where he crouched. A loud voice called out, and Jack recognized the calm orders of a commander. The black-robed leader of the mob had arrived to take charge. Another volley of gunshots rang out. More bodies slumped to the ground as bullets found their mark. The bandit leader roared at his men, bellowing orders, and the mob started to form a crude line facing the gunfire, ignoring their brethren who had been struck down. More men were summoned from the darkness to join the defensive position. Those with firearms squatted down, aiming their pieces into the darkness. At a fierce word of command, they opened fire, delivering a volley that tore out into the night. It was nothing like the volley a British battalion could deliver. Instead of barking out in unison, the bandits' fusillade dragged out, many seconds passing between the first shot and the last. Yet the black-robed leader had got his men fighting back, aiming at the flashes of light that revealed the presence of their enemy. The incoming fire stopped. The silence stretched out, the powder smoke from the volley drifting away on the light breeze that flitted across the open ground. The enemy had disappeared. The bandits looked at each other, their anxiety obvious. The silence pulled at their nerves, the sudden calm as threatening as the shots that had thundered round them. Their black-robed leader walked his horse forward, peering into the darkness, trying to sense where the danger had gone. Then came a new sound. It was barely audible at first, nothing more than a gentle murmur from far in the distance. But it grew slowly and steadily, building in intensity, the tempo increasing into a regular staccato rhythm. The bandits shrank back as the noise increased, their thin line contracting in fear, the frightened men seeking the comfort of being close to one another. The drumming was relentless, the vibration reverberating through the ground, so it felt as though the soil trembled under their feet. Jack peered into the darkness, his eyes searching for the source of the ominous noise. He could see nothing but shadows, menacing shapes that flitted across his vision. "What is it?" He felt Isabel's breath on his cheek as she whispered the question. He had not heard her approach, the subtle sounds of her movement lost in the constant drumming that continued to build, hammering into their eardrums, the vibration jarring their bodies. Jack was given no time to answer. From the depths of the darkness, a mass of horsemen charged forward. They emerged in one long line, their riders stirrup to stirrup. With a sudden roar, they gouged their spurs into their horses' flanks, urging them on, the final yards to be covered as quickly as possible as the riders committed their mounts to the all-consuming madness of the charge. Jack was aware of a sense of order as the cavalry burst from the night, the controlled ranks evidence of countless hours of training. The riders wore sky-blue tunics with tight white breeches and a single pouch belt from right shoulder to left hip. On their heads, each wore a square-topped helmet with a single thick white plume that stood proud on the peak. They made a fine sight as they galloped out of the darkness, the splendour of the cavalry charge revealed in all of its dreadful glory. In the white-gloved hand of each horseman was a lance, its long shaft braced under the right arm. The razor-sharp points moved lower as the riders tensed for the point of impact, the deadly blades keening for the blood of the enemy. The unstoppable wall of death hurtled forward. The lancers' faces twisted into snarls of hatred as they picked the first targets for their dreadful weapons. The terrified bandits broke. The gunfire had brought them together, but now they scattered in every direction, throwing their weapons to the floor in their desperate haste to escape. Yet there was nowhere for them to run, no sanctuary to be found on the barren hillside. From his hidden viewpoint, Jack saw confusion tear through their ranks. He was close enough to see the panic on their faces, their despair and terror as they rode to escape the terrifying charge. The lancers rode on to the hilltop, their line still steady and straight. And the killing began. Lances were pulled back as the cavalrymen picked their targets, their tension released as they thrust their weapons forward. They speared their first victims, the sharpened points exploding into the flesh of the men who were trying to escape. The precise line broke up as the first bandits fell to the ground, their bodies torn by the dreadful weapons. The lancers raced on, overrunning and cutting down the enemy without mercy. Some turned to fight, lifting sabres or talwars to try to counter the dreadful combination of man and beast that thundered towards them. These men at least died with a weapon in their hands, yet not one lancer was unseated, not one horse cut or speared by their desperate acts of defiance. Those brave enough to stand their ground, pierced by the deadly reach of the lance before they could strike back. The lancers ruthlessly pursued the fleeing bandits, determined that none would escape. Jack watched in morbid fascination as the fight descended into a hunt, and the lancers spurred after their foe, breaking ranks to ride down any bandit still alive. In front of the barricade, the black-robed leader stood motionless. For a moment, Jack was certain the bandits' leader would charge the lancers, but instead he gathered his reins in one black gauntleted hand and whirled his horse round, ramming his heels into the animal's sides as he made his own bid for safety. A handful of his men followed their chief, throwing away their weapons in their desperate flight. It was only as the black-robed leader galloped clear that Jack realized where he was. The bandits had conducted their doomed defense on the top of a hill that dominated the surrounding area. It was clear of any building, the closest peasant hovel a good 200 yards away down the slope. Jack thrust his head past the barricade, looking round to confirm that his first suspicion had been correct. The tower rose away above him, its aged stone sides stretching up into the night. The tower that Isabel had been so keen to visit. With nowhere else to run, many of the fleeing men were making for the tower. None would reach it. They were slaughtered to a man, struck down by the lancers who callously butchered them as they tried to escape. Jack and Isabel watched the orgy of death that was happening a matter of yards from where they hid. The corridor to the prison was slightly to one side of the tower, screened from view by a thick clump of thorny bushes. Jack could only guess that their improvised prison provided some sort of storage for the main tower. The simple room hacked from the ground to shelter precious supplies or valuable animals from the torrid weather that would besiege the area for so much of the year. Yet they were not totally hidden. 2 bandits fleeing from the Lancer's charge must have seen the glow from the entrance as they ran from the slaughter, and they changed direction, heading straight for the barricade.
Danbury!
Isabel saw the danger first, her fingers clutching at Jack's arm as she called out in alarm.
Get back! Now! Damn it! Move!
Jack pushed her back down the corridor and away from the barricade. His haste made him rough, and she tripped as she tried to obey, clattering painfully to the ground so that she lay sprawled directly behind where Jack would have to fight.
Stay down!
Jack cursed under his breath as he failed to get Isabel out of sight. Yet there was no time for any further action, the 2 desperate bandits now only a few yards away from the barricade. Jack glanced around and noticed the musket that had been dropped by the turbaned defender. Without hesitation, he threw down his stolen talwar and snatched the firearm up, his hands curling round the familiar shape. It felt warm to his touch, and he savoured the comforting weight. It had been a long time since he had last handled a musket, yet he felt the confidence surge through him. The leading bandit reached the barricade. He slashed his sabre in an arc to drive Jack away from the simple obstruction. Jack eased his weight back, letting the sword whisper past inches in front of his face. It was almost too easy. He saw the look of astonishment on the bandit's face as his blow missed its target, the dreadful realization that he had left himself wide open and defenseless. 1. Jack stamped his foot down, throwing his weight forward as he thrust the bayonet into the bandit's body. 2. He twisted the weapon as the bayonet ripped into the man's stomach, turning the blade to stop it becoming stuck in the dying man's flesh. 3. He recovered his weapon, pulling it back with as much force as he had driven it forward, carelessly slicing the blade through the desperate fingers that grasped it in despair. 4. He stamped his foot forward again, aiming the blade at the stomach of the second bandit, who had been revealed as the body of the first slid screaming to the floor. The bayonet reached over the top of the barricade as Jack thrust with all his strength. In desperation, the second bandit tried to parry the blow, swiping his sword sideways in a frantic attempt to beat the weapon aside. 5. Jack pulled the musket back as soon as he felt the bandit's sword batter against it. He saw the man's eyes flash white as he tried to recover from the desperate counter, his wild defence unbalancing him and leaving him wide open. 6. Again, Jack stamped forward, ramming his blade into the centre of the second bandit's body, paying no heed to the sabre that carved a thick slice of wood from the weapon's barrel as the man's parry arrived a heartbeat too late to save him. 7. He pulled the musket back, ignoring the thick pulse of blood that gushed over the bayonet to run through the thick groove in its top that was designed for that very purpose. The second bandit slumped to the ground, collapsing over the body of the first, both men victims of Jack's ruthless skill. Jack paused, his muscles tensed. He'd felt nothing as he fought, every movement instinctive. It was the drill that was hammered into every raw recruit, the drill masters relentless in their pursuit of perfection as they instilled in the redcoats the ability to use the vicious bayonet with ruthless precision. It was the training that made every one of them a killer. Past the barricade, the fight was over. The bodies of the bandits were scattered across the ground, some lying in heaps where 6 men had been slain in a huddle, some sprawled singly, their torn corpses left to pour their lifeblood into the dusty soil alone. The bandits had been massacred, barely a handful escaping the ruthlessly executed attack. The tiger's band of misfits and renegades had been broken. Chapter 12. Is it over? Isabel's voice was timid. She still lay on the floor and her hands lifted to cover her face as she saw the British officer turn, his face still twisted in the awful snarl of a killer, blood dripping from the tip of the bayonet that he had wielded with such dreadful purpose. He was a figure from a nightmare, and Isabel felt fear flutter in her heart. The presence of death was so close that she could smell the sour tang of spilt blood and the sickly sweet aroma of torn flesh. He'd killed the men in a matter of seconds, dispatching their souls in front of her terrified gaze. Now he came towards her, and for a moment she thought the dreadful gore-smeared blade would reach for her. Then she saw his face change. The tension left his expression, a trace of the familiar rueful smile returning. "My apologies. I didn't mean to push you so hard." He offered her his hand to help her to her feet. The change in his manner was sudden, from killer to civilized gentleman in a single heartbeat. Yet Isabel hesitated, her heart still pounding as she contemplated the strong hand reaching down to her. She saw the blood that was already turning black on his skin, the spilt blood of his enemies staining his flesh. She could only wonder at what stain such a fight would leave on his soul. She saw the flicker of annoyance flitter across his face when she did not immediately respond to his command. Ignoring the fear that squirmed inside her, she obeyed, placing her much smaller hand into his and allowing herself to be pulled to her feet. As she stood, she looked into his dark grey eyes. They met her scrutiny calmly as they stood within inches of each other. She saw then the life in his soul, the burning spark that belied the suffering and the burden she sensed he carried. She had watched him kill, and he had terrified her with his merciless skill. Yet she was drawn to him like no other man she had known. He pulled back, as if suddenly awkward to be so close to her. "Go back to your father. Tell him we're safe." He gave the order brusquely, yet she heard his breath catch in his throat. She knew then that she wanted him. She wanted the British captain to be hers. Jack slid over the barricade, keeping the musket with its bloody bayonet in his right hand. He stepped carefully over the bodies of his fallen enemies before striding forward with a confidence that belied the dread settling deep in his gut. A cry of alarm greeted his sudden appearance. The nearest blue-coated lancer spied him and immediately wrenched at the reins of his horse that were bundled into his left hand. Jack saw the lance blade twitch as the cavalryman brought the point up before he jabbed his spurs into the mount's side, urging it into a quick walk. More lancers turned to stare at the white-faced redcoat who had emerged unannounced into their midst. Many had already dismounted and were going through the laborious task of checking that the many fallen bodies were indeed dead. Those that were not were quickly dispatched with a blade across the throat. There was to be no mercy that day. Jack's mouth went dry as the lancer increased his speed. The razor-sharp tip of the lance was aimed directly at his heart. It never wavered, even as the horse's gait changed from a trot to a canter. Jack knew then what terror the bandits must have experienced as the lancers burst from the night. He had felt it once before, and the memory of a gloomy Crimean field surged into his mind. The lancers that day had been Russian Cossacks, but his fear of the wicked weapon was the same. He stood tall, letting his confidence show in his bearing. He would not betray fear. He was a British officer, and he faced the lancer with all the dignity that his assumed rank bestowed. He threw the musket to one side and lifted both hands, holding them palms facing forward, showing the lancer that he presented no threat. The lancer gave no sign of recognizing the gesture. Jack saw his body tense as the horse increased speed, the rider bending slightly at the waist as he lifted his weight from the saddle. "Stop!" Jack shouted the command. More heads turned at the foreign word, yet the lancer plunged on regardless. The horse's hooves drummed into the ground, the rhythm that Jack had heard earlier now reserved for him alone. His body trembled as he saw the lance point rushing towards him, his flesh twitching in expectation as though he could already feel the icy blade sinking in. Yet he refused to turn, to throw himself to safety. He stood in the rider's path, as still as a training ground mannequin, his pride his only defence. The rhythmic pounding of the horse's hooves stopped abruptly in a harsh jangle of tackle as the lancer reined in hard, bringing his mount to a noisily, breathless halt. The two men stared at each other. "You are a brave man, Englishman." The voice was full of obvious humour, the words reverberating as the lancer chuckled. Jack pulled hard at the flanks of his scarlet coat, straightening the thickly woven cloth that had ridden up as he had clambered over the barricade. It dawned on him that the lancer's charge had been a test of courage. He hoped he had passed. The point of the lance was no more than 6 inches away from his breast, the deadly blade held completely still. With heart still pounding, he looked up into the grinning face of the lancer. "And you're a fair rider. I commend your skill." He spoke the words as calmly as he could, ignoring the vicious point that trembled as its owner laughed aloud at Jack's sang-froid. The horseman pulled back the lance, turning to toss the long weapon to a bearer who had rushed up the moment he had stopped. For the first time, Jack noticed that the man who had come so close to killing him was dressed differently from the rest of the blue-coated lancers. The white pouch belt was missing, replaced instead with golden frogging that covered the front panel of the lancer's blue coat. His shoulder boards carried thick bullion epaulets, and his helmet was missing the thick white plume that Jack had noticed all the other lancers wearing.
"Good morning, Englishman. I am the Maharajah of Sawad, and you owe me your life." "Did you see the bastard escape?"
"I did."
"Damn it. Damn it all to hell."
The Maharajah cursed as Jack gave him the news that the black-robed leader of the bandits had given him the slip. The ruler of Sawad spoke fluent English without a trace of an accent, and he clearly relished the opportunity to converse with a British officer. The two men sat perched on the barricade that Jack had hidden behind, whilst the lancers went around the bloody business of clearing the hilltop of its gruesome debris. The Maharajah pulled off his heavy helmet, wiping a hand across his forehead to slick away a thick band of sweat. To Jack's surprise, he was completely hairless, his bald crown crisscrossed with a network of scars, a map of a life of hard-earned experience. The rest of his body was compact and powerful. He was clearly not the kind of ruler to live the decadent lifestyle of popular imagination. He was a warrior, and he carried himself with the calm poise of a man assured of his own power. Jack sensed the Maharajah looking at him. He was finding it easy to like the foreign ruler, whose brown eyes twinkled with hidden mirth, as if he was party to a special joke that only he found amusing. He was an engaging man, and Jack had to remind himself to stay on his guard. The Maharajah could well soon be an enemy of the crown, something Jack would do well to remember.
"So, what is your name, Englishman?"
The Maharajah's gaze never left Jack's as he spoke, as if he was searching the Englishman's soul.
"Lark,
Danbury." The words stuck in Jack's throat. For reasons he did not truly understand, he had been about to reveal his given name. The Maharajah's scrutiny was unsettling, and even telling the habitual lie was made hard. Jack swallowed his anxiety and forced himself to concentrate. As intimate as the situation was, he had a notion that his life was still in danger. His hesitation was not lost on the Maharajah. The warm smile faded as the ruler of Sawad contemplated Jack's stumble.
"Well met, Captain Danbury."
The smile returned with all its former force.
"I had heard you had arrived, but I didn't expect to meet you so soon. Welcome to Sawad."
"Do you greet all your visitors so?" The memory of the bitter fight with the bandits was still very real in Jack's mind.
"I'm truly sorry you were attacked.
The tiger and his filthy band have been a thorn in my side for too long."
"Not any more."
"We shall see.
I'll not rest until that bastard is dead."
The Maharajah spat as he cursed the bandit leader. "I've a feeling he'll be a hard man to run down." The Maharajah looked at Jack sharply.
"Did you fight him?"
Jack met the unrelenting stare. "I did." He paused before continuing. "I lost." The Maharajah nodded in understanding.
"He fights hard. The local people will tell you that he is invincible, that he is a prince of darkness that no mortal man can slay. How I look forward to proving them wrong. If he ever stays around long enough to fight me, he will die with my bloody lance rammed up his damned arse."
Jack remembered the power in the black-robed leader's blows, the speed with which he had thrust and parried. Mortal or not, he was a deadly adversary.
"I wish you luck." "Luck? I don't need luck. Give me my lance and my horse, and I'll see him dead."
The smile was gone, replaced instead with a look of iron determination.
Jack shuddered involuntarily as he remembered facing the Maharajah's charge. It would be a rare spectacle indeed if the two warriors ever did meet in combat. So, why today? Jack asked the question that had been in his mind ever since he had first spotted the organised attack on the bandits. "Because of you, of course." The Maharajah leant forward to clap his hands on Jack's thigh. "I've been chasing the tiger and his cursed band for weeks now. I would not have found them had he not attacked you. One of my patrols heard the gunfire, and happily I was close enough to get here before the bastards disappeared again. It was good fortune for us both, I think. Besides, I couldn't let some bloody bandits kill 3 British subjects. That damned man Proudfoot would have made too much of it." "Then I must thank you." "Yes, you must." The Maharajah laughed aloud at the notion. "You must sing my praises and tell that bloody man that he would do well to leave me alone. I suffer his presence as I must. I have my own father to thank for that. But he grows too puffed up with importance for his own good and for the good of you all. He works here, he does not rule." "You should tell him that yourself. You're more than eloquent enough. You speak English as well as any of us." "Well, that's the benefit of an English education, old man." The Maharajah was relaxed. If he found it odd to be sitting chatting whilst only a matter of yards away his troops were gathering up the remains of men who just an hour before had been living and breathing, it did not show in his bonhomie and easy manner. "My father insisted. He'd been forced to sign away some of his power to you damn British, so he wanted to make sure I was educated in your ways and in your language. Knowing your enemy, he called it. And I thank him daily for his foresight." The Maharajah turned away as 2 of his lancers approached. He slid off the barricade and issued a series of firm commands before turning back to face Jack once more. "We have captured more of the tiger's men, but there is no sign of the bastard himself. He has flown the coop." He smiled, relishing his use of English idiom. More lancers appeared, dragging a motley collection of bedraggled bandits with them. The unfortunate souls had been well beaten, none able to hold their heads up or take much notice of their surroundings. The Maharajah issued further commands, his orders delivered with crisp authority. His men hurried to obey, immediately starting to strip the clothes from their bloodied captives. "What will happen to them?" Jack asked as he slid from his perch, walking forward to stand at the Maharajah's side. The 2 men watched in silence as the lancers quickly stripped the surviving bandits naked before dragging them off towards the village. "They will die." The Maharajah fixed Jack with a firm glare, daring him to disapprove. "How will they die?" Jack was not easily cowed, even by a king. "They will be taken to the village so that those poor wretches who survived their attentions can witness their fate. They will be tied to the ground and left as food for the wild dogs, but only after we have removed their manhood." The Maharajah searched Jack's face for reaction. Jack wrestled with his emotions, doing his best to keep his expression neutral. The transformation in the Maharajah was sudden and shocking. One moment he was a civilized gentleman, talking with all the ease of a member of a London club. The next, he was a savage warrior king who could crook a single finger and order a man's death in a heartbeat. "Do you disapprove, Danbury? Do you find my orders barbaric?" The Maharajah dared Jack to speak out. Jack did not disappoint him. "I do." He took a deep breath before speaking his mind, unable to stay silent. "If they deserve to die, then why submit them to such foul torture? I understand the need for death, but I don't see the need for suffering." The Maharajah acknowledged his words with a nod. "It takes courage to gainsay a king, Danbury. You at least are not all powder and no balls. unlike so many of your damned countrymen." He sighed. "You know nothing of our ways, you damned English. You think you can apply your customs and your laws even though you're thousands of miles from home. I admire that. Your conceit and arrogance is something to respect, but it also makes you dangerous. We want what is best, for you and your people." "What is best? And who are you to say what is best? Who appointed the English as the arbitrator of what is right and what is wrong? Do we not know what is best for ourselves? Do I not know what is best for my people?" The Maharajah shook his head to compose himself. His passion had risen as he had spoken, and it took a moment for him to bring his rising temper back under control. "These men are punished as an example to their kind and as a warning to their bastard leader. He will know what manner of man I am." "He didn't strike me as the kind of man who would be easily frightened," Jack dared to respond forcefully. "Not even by that." But the Maharajah did not seem the least bit offended. He smiled at Jack's forthright opinion. "I will rid the world of the tiger, Danbury. This is my land. It is my people who suffer at his hands. I will find him. I will kill him, and I will drag his carcass through every town and every village so that my people may know that I killed the man who could not be killed. They will see their ruler still protects them, and that my army still guards their future. They will see that it is I who rule here, and not some white-faced strangers who think they can buy my kingdom and bind me up in all those bits of paper that they set such stock by. These are my people. You English would do well to remember that." Jack saw the passion on the Maharajah's face as he spoke. He thought of Proudfoot and his plans to annex the state of Saward, regardless of his legal right to do so. He knew then that any such plan would result in conflict. The Maharajah would never surrender the future of his kingdom without a fight. Dutton would get his wish. If Proudfoot were intent on annexation, then there would surely be war in Saward.